Chiron came to his senses when someone shook him by the shoulder and shouted something about a gray ripple. He was kneeling in the mud in the middle of a market that wasn't his own, and he couldn't remember how he'd ended up there. People were running all around him. Merchants were dropping their stalls. A woman was dragging two children by the hand and looking back toward the west. Chiron looked in the same direction, and his fingers dug into the ground of their own accord. The horizon was vanishing. The road along which the caravans traveled was simply ceasing to exist. In its place, a wall of gray ripples rolled by, to boiling fog. Where the ripples touched a hill, the hill became flat. Where they touched a tree, the tree crumbled into a set of lines, and the lines melted away. Chiron opened his mouth to scream, and at that moment, someone else's memory flooded his mind. He remembered another life. He remembered a stage and lights and thousands of faces in the darkness of the hall. He had been a musician. He had died at his last concert before finishing the final movement, and the darkness had taken him right there at the piano. And then there was this mud and this market and this body of a skinny guy in his 20s with calluses from the strings on his fingers. The body's name was also Chiron. The body belonged to a wandering zither player whom they fed out of pity in this refugee camp. There was no time to figure it out. A commotion was spreading through the camp. Only one man stood between it and the people. An elderly man in a gray cloak embroidered with runes was tracing symbols in the air with his staff. The symbols flashed and formed a transparent wall. Chiron had heard the refugees call him the Weaver and Master Halder. People huddled behind him like sheep behind a shepherd. The swarm reached the transparent wall and pressed against it with all its might. The wall began to hum. The symbols began to fade one by one. Halder growled and drew a new row of symbols, but the ripple devoured them faster than he could draw them. A crack ran down the wall. Someone let out a loud howl. The head of the caravan guard, named Brant, drew his sword, though there was nothing to cut through the mist with. And then, in Chiron's mind, the sound of a tuning fork rang out. A pure A note hung in his consciousness, and with it came words. The words informed him that the system of world harmony had completed its binding to the host. The words informed him that this world was shaken by chaos, and that the laws of reality here were held together only by complete forms. The most perfect complete form is music. A finished piece performed before an audience anchors a fragment of the world and makes it real. An unfinished piece does nothing. The system warned that an interrupted melody is worse than silence. Chiron clenched his teeth and looked around. An old zither lay by an overturned tray. The soundboard was cracked. 5 of the 7 strings remained intact. He grabbed it and ran, not away from the ripples, but toward them. Brant shouted after him that the fool had chosen a strange place to die. Chiron didn't answer. He stopped 10 paces behind Halder, sat down right in the mud, and placed the zither on his lap. His fingers trembled. He forced them to rest on the strings. In his past life, he'd spent 40 years learning to finish what he'd started. He knew thousands of pieces, but now he chose the simplest one. An old lullaby from his world. 3 parts: introduction, development, and conclusion. He plucked the strings. The first notes were drowned out by the screams. No one was listening. The system coldly informed him that a piece played without an audience secured only a small patch of land beneath the performer. Chiron played louder. He poured everything he knew into the lullaby. He played as if it were his last time. And the screams began to subside. First, the children fell silent. Then a woman with 2 children stopped and turned around. Then Brant froze, his sword now useless. People didn't understand what was happening, but the melody gripped them by the throat and wouldn't let go. The system began its countdown. 12 listeners. 40 listeners. 100 listeners. Each listener turned into a thin thread of resonance, and the threads flowed toward the zither. Chiron felt the cracked zither warm beneath his palms. He finished the introduction and moved into the development. At that moment, the ripples broke through Halder's wall. The cymbals burst like soap bubbles. Halder fell to one knee and shielded himself with his staff. A gray mist hung over him and the entire market. People should have run, but no one did. The melody held them faster than fear. Chiron played the development and saw out of the corner of his eye how the ripples were slowing. Where the sound of the zither touched the mist thickened and came to a standstill. The system reported that 217 listeners had been detected and that the stabilization power had reached the threshold. All that remained was to complete the form. Chiron took a deep breath and began the final section, the very one he hadn't finished playing in his past life. His fingers flew across the 5 strings, drawing the sound of 7 from them. He played the last 4 measures with his eyes closed. The final note fell into the silence like a stone into a well, and the world around him clicked. Chiron opened his eyes. A golden wave radiated outward from the zither in all directions. It passed through the people, through the tents, through the remains of Halder's wall, and struck the gray ripples. The ripples did not recede. The ripples simply ended. The fog settled onto the ground as ordinary morning mist. The road returned to its place. The hill became a hill again, though the tree on it had now turned blue. A ringing silence hung over the market. Then a woman with 2 children began to weep aloud. Then everyone screamed at once. People rushed toward Chiron, and he barely managed to press the zither to his chest so it wouldn't be crushed. His hands were patted on the shoulders. They grabbed his hands. An old woman thrust a dry flatbread at him. Brant stood to the side and stared at him without blinking. The chief guard slowly sheathed his sword, approached, and crouched down across from him. He stared for a long time at the cracked citra, then at Chiron's thin arms, then at his face. Just that morning, this man had kicked a wandering citra player away from the pot of soup. Now he removed a water flask from his belt and silently held it out. Chiron took the flask and drank half of it in one gulp. Meanwhile, the system was summarizing the results. An area with a radius of 300 paces has been secured. 217 response threads have been received. The carrier level has been raised from 0 to 1. Access to the score repository has been granted. Chiron listened to this report, and his lips curled into a smile of their own accord. And then a shadow fell over him. Master Halder stood above him. The weaver leaned on his staff, and his hands were trembling. Chiron expected thanks. He was wrong. Halder spoke quietly, and at the sound of his voice, the crowd recoiled. He said that today he had witnessed an unregistered distortion of the foundations. He said that the Weavers' Guild had been keeping these lands from falling apart for 300 years, and that the right to anchor reality belonged solely to the Guild, according to the charter of the 7 cities. He said that the boy with the citra would either report to the Guild and place his gift under their control, or he would be declared a wild source. Chiron asked what they do with wild sources. Halder looked at him as if he were an empty space and replied that wild sources aren't judged. They're extinguished. The weaver turned and walked away through the parting crowd. At the edge of the market, he took a bone dove from his cloak, whispered something to it, and tossed it into the air. The dove spread its wings and flew eastward, toward the nearest guild city lying beyond the hills. Brant watched the bird fly away and cursed under his breath. He told Chiron that the bone mail reaches the city in a single day. He said that the guild hunters arrive in 2. Chiron wanted to reply that he'd have time to get away. He didn't manage to open his mouth. The ground beneath his feet trembled slightly. The blue tree on the hill bent in a wind that wasn't there. People were still laughing and hugging each other, but Chiron was already looking westward over their heads. Where the gray ripples had ended an hour ago, the horizon was once again losing its sharpness. Only now, the wall of fog wasn't rising just to the rooftops. It was rising all the way to the clouds. The system dispassionately reported that the secured area was drawing in chaos like a bonfire draws in moths. The brighter the bonfire, the larger the moths. The second wave is estimated to be 6 times stronger than the first. 2 hours until it arrives. Chiron looked at his citra. The 6th string had snapped while he was drinking water. 4 remained. 2 hours is very little time when you have 4 strings and 200 people behind you. Chiron jumped onto an overturned barrel and shouted for anyone who could hold an instrument to come to him. The crowd buzzed. They had just witnessed a miracle, so they obeyed quickly. Of the 200 refugees, 9 turned out to be musicians. An old man with a bone flute, 2 sisters with rattles, a boy with a homemade drum made from a cauldron. The rest held spoons, combs, and empty jugs in their hands. Chiron surveyed this army, and his shoulders slumped. The system had indicated that the strength of the formation depended not on the number of performers, but on the completeness of the form and the number of listeners. 9 unskilled apprentices could break the formation faster than they could build it. Chiron jumped down from the barrel and began assigning the simplest parts. To the flute, a single repeating motif of 4 notes. To the drum, a steady pulse. The rattles were to come in only at the end. Meanwhile, Brant arranged the people in a semicircle so that everyone would be a listener and no one would scatter. The wind was picking up. The wind was blowing from the wall of fog and smelled of thunder and rust. And then, through that wind, Chiron heard a harp. The sound came from the northern road. It was clear and strong, and it cut through the wind like a knife cuts through fabric. A girl in a traveling cloak, carrying a large frame harp on her back, was walking along the road toward the camp. She was walking against the wind, but her cloak wasn't flapping. The air around her lay still, like water in a cup. The girl entered the camp, stopped in front of Chiron, and looked him up and down. She said she had been following the trail of yesterday's storm for 3 days, and that this morning she had sensed someone in the middle of this wasteland playing a complete form. She said that people like that could be counted on one hand across all the lands. Then she looked at the wall of fog stretching up to the clouds and asked if he had a plan or if he was going to die with dignity. Chiron replied that he had a plan but lacked the high voice. The girl took the harp from her shoulder and introduced herself as Selena. The wind around her stirred like a dog at its mistress's feet. Chiron realized she was more than just a harpist. She was playing on the air itself. There was less than an hour left to rehearse. Chiron didn't choose a lullaby. Against the wall reaching up to the clouds, what was needed was not silence, but a storm against a storm. He drew from the memory of his past life an old 3-part Highlander dance with a crescendo in the finale. He sang the high part to Selena once. She repeated it without a single mistake and added such an ornament that the old man with the pipe dropped it. Chiron silently picked up the pipe and returned it to the old man. You can't describe the rehearsal as a montage because there wasn't one. There was a single run-through of the first part and Chiron's shout that everyone should play the second and third parts from the sheet, that is, following his lead. A wall of fog had reached the blue tree by the time they began. The drum set the beat. The 4-stringed zither led the main theme. The harp soared from above, and for a second, Chiron forgot about the chaos because no one had ever played with him like that, not even in his past life. Selena didn't just hold the upper voice. She sent a wind swirling in a circle over the crowd, and the wind carried the sound all the way to the farthest rows. The audience was no longer just 200. It was the entire camp, down to the very last hard-of-hearing old man. The system counted the threads of response. 300, 500, 740. A wall of ripples crashed down on the secured area, and the area groaned. Chiron felt that groan in his ribs. The blue tree at the border shattered into lines. The outermost tents melted like wax. People screamed but kept listening because the harp wouldn't let them go. The first part ended. The second part moved faster. Chiron played and watched as the ripples gnawed into his 300 paces and devoured them down to 200, down to 150. The boy with the drum lost his beat. The pulse faltered, and the rhythm went off track. The system issued a warning about the risk of the piece breaking off. Chiron did what he had learned over the 40 years of his past life. He turned the mistake into a technique. He picked up the lost rhythm with the zither, repeated it twice as if that were the plan all along, and brought the drum back to the correct beat. The boy caught the pulse and began to cry, never stopping his beat on the kettle. The third part began, the build-up. Selena understood without words and whipped up a column of wind. Dust and sparks from the fires swirled above the camp in a funnel. Chiron strummed the 4 strings so hard that his fingers burst and blood flowed across the soundboard. He felt no pain. He felt only the approach of the final chord, like the approach of a cliff at his feet. And he leaped. Everyone struck the final chord together. A flute, a rattle, a drum, a harp, a zither, and 1,000 voices that cried out in unison. A golden wave surged from the earth in a column toward the sky. The wall of fog burst across its entire width like a severed sail. The sky beyond it turned out to be an ordinary evening sky with the first stars. A silence fell so deep that you could hear the crackling of the campfire at the other end of the camp. Then the camp erupted. People were dancing. Strangers were hugging each other. The elder of the refugees, a gray-haired, sinewy man named Gottfried, who that morning had told everyone that the vagabond with the zither would bring nothing but trouble, pushed his way through the crowd toward Chiron. He stood before him, chewed his lips for a long time, and then slowly dropped to one knee. The others began to kneel behind him. Hundreds of people, kneeling in the mud, stared at the musician with bloodied fingers. Chiron was taken aback and looked at Selena. Selena did not kneel. She was examining him with a newfound interest, the way one might examine a rare instrument. The system reported that 890 threads of response had been received, that the carrier level had been raised to the 3rd, and that the permanent anchor function had been activated. A permanent anchor transforms the designated area into an immutable point in the world, but requires a stationary resonator, in other words, a hall. A real hall with the right stone and the right shape. Chiron asked the system where such a stone could be found in these lands. The system showed him a map and marked a point 6 days' journey to the south. The ancient Eckhorn Amphitheater, built by a lost civilization at the intersection of 7 stone veins. Chiron stared at that spot, and a feeling grew inside him that he hadn't experienced even at the best concerts of his past life. He didn't see a hall, he saw a city. A city where music holds the walls together more firmly than stone. He wasn't given time to finish his thought. A rider on a foaming horse burst into the camp from the eastern road. It was the merchant who had left for the guild city that morning. He was still shouting from the saddle. He shouted that sheets bearing a bone seal were already hanging on every post along the road. The Weavers' Guild had declared a wild source named Chiron a threat to the very foundations of the world. 500 gold pieces were promised for his head, 700 for him alive. A squad of hunters had left the city at noon today. The crowd fell silent. Gottfried rose from his knees, and his face turned ashen. Brant placed his hand on his sword. And then Selena took a step forward and stood beside Chiron, shoulder to shoulder. She said that the guild's hunters travel the roads. She said that the wind asks no questions of the roads. Chiron looked south into the darkness where Ehorn lay. Then he turned to face the hundreds of faces lit by the campfires. He asked aloud who would go with him to build a city that did not yet exist. A forest of raised hands shot up before he had even finished speaking. And to the east, beyond the hills, the first flickering light of a torch was already visible. The torches in the east had decided everything for them. The camp broke ground in less than an hour. Chiron walked at the head of the column, and his fingers, wrapped in rags, ached with every step. 600 people stretched out across the nighttime wasteland. 36 carts creaked. 4 cows, which Gottfried had refused to abandon, were lowing. Brant, with 20 guards, brought up the rear of the column and was literally burning the bridges across the ravines behind them. None of the refugees knew the way south because there was no road to the south. The southern lands were considered a death trap. Chaos reigned there, and a hill in the morning could become a lake by evening. Only one person could lead the column through such a place, and that person turned out to be neither Selena nor Chiron. On the second night of the journey, a woman in a faded blue dress, her eyes closed, stepped out of the darkness toward the lead wagon. The guards grabbed their weapons. The woman did not stop. She walked with her eyes closed but steered clear of every rock. She stopped in front of Chiron, opened her eyes, and her eyes turned out to be pupilless, like 2 silver mirrors. She said her name was Ivain, that she had been hearing his music for 3 days now, even though he wasn't playing, and that if the column continued on its current course, by dawn it would enter a fold in space from which there was no return. Brant asked how a vagrant from the wasteland could know such a thing. Instead of answering, Ivain began to sing softly. Her voice was hollow and strange, and above her palms, the song coalesced into an image. Everyone standing nearby saw a column of wagons in the air entering an invisible boundary and disappearing piece by piece. First the horses vanished, then the front wheels, then the screams. The image faded away with the last note. Ivain staggered, and Chiron caught her by the elbow. She explained in a hoarse voice that she had been born with a hearing that perceived the world inside out. Each of her songs turns into a vision of what was or what will be. The price is simple. Every vision takes a day of her life. In the villages, she'd been burned at the stake 3 times for it. She showed the scars on her wrists, and Selena turned away, clenching her fists. Chiron looked at Ivain for a long time. Then he said that in his city, no one would ever lay a hand on her, and that from now on, she would sing only when she wanted to. Ivain blinked her silver eyes. It seemed as though this was the first time in her entire life she'd heard the word city spoken to her. From then on, she led the column. The 6-day journey turned into 9 because Ivain led the people away from the ravines 3 times and once from a pack of gray wolves that had 6 legs each and no snouts. On the 9th morning, the column climbed to the ridge, and below, everyone saw Ehorn. The amphitheater lay in a basin between 7 cliffs like a crown that had fallen from the sky. Thousands of stone benches converged in circles toward a perfectly level stage made of black stone. Even in ruins, even overgrown, it was beautiful, so that the entire crowd on the ridge fell silent. Chiron was the first to descend onto the stage. He stood in its center and clapped his hands once. The clap echoed back to him evenly from all sides, and the system enthusiastically reported that the resonator's quality exceeded the calculated value by a factor of 4. 7 stone veins converged directly beneath the stage. Chiron stood in the center of the dead amphitheater and saw the living city. There's no need to describe the construction day by day, so here are 4 snapshots. Snapshot 1. During the first week, 600 people cleared away the rubble, and every evening Chiron performed a complete play on stage. After the 3rd evening, dust stopped settling on the stones. After the 5th night, the cracked benches began to fuse together on their own, just as bones fuse. A mason named Ulbert, a man with hands like shovels, walked along the joints, poking at them with his finger and repeating that stone doesn't behave that way. Snapshot 2. By the end of the first month, walls of woven mist had risen around the bowl, which Chiron secured a 7-voice nocturne. Ulbert didn't believe in walls made of sound and pointedly struck them with a sledgehammer. The sledgehammer bounced back and hummed until evening. Ulbert remained silent for 3 days, then came to Chiron and asked him to teach his son to play an instrument. Cut 3. By the end of the second month, the first outsiders arrived in the city. 40 families had heard from merchants about a place where there was no chaos. Then 200 families. Then the numbers reached the thousands, and Gottfried started a thick ledger and grumbled that the ink was running out faster than the bread. Cut 4. At the beginning of the third month, Chiron climbed to the top tier and looked down. Terraced houses, the market, workshops, the school where Selena taught 12 children, 3 of whom could already maintain a simple form. That evening, the city was given a name. Chiron gathered everyone in the bowl and declared that the place where song becomes law should be called Cantora. 10,000 voices shouted the name, and the system recorded a peak of 11,000 threads of response at once. The carrier level reached level 7. The permanent anchor engaged all 7 strands, and Cantora became the first fixed point on the map of the south. The weather inside the walls followed a schedule. Time flowed evenly. At night, one could sleep without tying oneself to a post in case the ground shifted. Over the course of 3 months, people had grown unaccustomed to fear, and that turned out to be a mistake. Brant was the first to notice that something was wrong. He now commanded the city guard, 100 blades, and rode the perimeter of the basin every morning. That morning, he brought a dead creature on his horse and tossed it onto the rocks in front of Chiron. The creature was the size of a dog, but consisted of fused pieces of various animals. Bird's claws, fish scales, 3 eyes arranged in a circle. Brant said he'd pulled it off the wall at dawn and that it wasn't the first one. Over the past week, the guards had burned 9 of them. The creatures came from the south, one by one, looked at the city, and left. Just like scouts. Yvonne turned pale even before she was asked to. She stepped out into the center of the stage on her own, sat down on a black stone, and began to sing, giving up a day of her life. A vision unfolded above the stage, so vast that the entire city could see it. To the south, beyond the ridge in the lands of free chaos, lay a crater. Within the crater, darkness swarmed, thousands of fused. Chaos had learned what it had not known before. It was no longer merely the weather. It was gathering a flock for itself, and the entire pack turned its heads northward, toward the fortified city that burned as brightly as a bonfire in the night. The vision faded. Yvonne collapsed onto her side, and Selena carried her away in her arms. A silence hung over Cantora, in which a single child began to weep. Chiron stood at the center of the stage and looked south over the walls he himself had sung into being. He did not go to sleep that night. He sat on the upper tier with a new 7-stringed silver zither that the city's craftsman had forged for him. As morning approached, the stone beneath his palm trembled slightly. The tremor came from the south. Steady, regular, like a step, like a great many steps in unison. The tremor grew stronger with every hour. By noon, cups in the houses were clinking on the shelves. By sunset, the edge of the swarm was already visible from the walls. It was advancing not as an avalanche, but in formation, and the guards' fingers turned white on their spear shafts as they held them steady against this orderly advance. Brant counted the first 4,000 bodies through his spyglass and stopped counting. Chiron gathered everyone on the stage. Selena stood at the northern edge so the wind would carry the sound along the walls. The 9 musicians from the first camp had grown over 3 months into an orchestra of 60, and Chiron arranged them in tiers. He strictly forbade Yvain from singing and placed him next to himself simply to listen from the sidelines and call out where to expect the attack. Gottfried led the children and the elderly to the lower galleries beneath the stage. Ulbert and the masons hauled cauldrons of hot resin up to the walls because he didn't believe that music alone could silence 4,000 mouths, and he was honest about that. The pack struck the walls after midnight. Chiron waited for the howling and roar, but the creatures were silent, and that was worse than a howl. Thousands of bodies pressed silently against the wall's impenetrable fog, and the walls sang with tension. The orchestra began to play the battle suite that Chiron had spent 3 months composing specifically for this night. 4 movements. Each completed movement sent a golden wave racing along the walls, and the wave scorched the creatures like boiling water on ants. The first movement swept the front ranks. The walls screamed with joy. Chiron did not rejoice. He saw what the system saw. The threads of resonance were being depleted faster than they could be replenished. The city was afraid, and fear stifles resonance. By the end of the second movement, the rear ranks of the swarm began to climb over the front ones, rising toward the crest of the wall like a living ladder. Ulbert's resin washed away 2 such ladders. It didn't reach the third in time. 3 dozen creatures at once spilled over the crest of the northern wall and fell onto the residential terraces. Brant, with 100 blades, met them in the narrow streets. The guards hacked at the fused bodies, but for every creature they felled, 2 more climbed over the crest. The orchestra began the third movement, and just then, Evine grabbed Chiron's sleeve. She whispered that she could hear a second layer beneath the swarm, that this entire silent mass was merely a hand, and at the center of the swarm walked the entity guiding that hand, the heart of the swarm, and it was singing. Chiron held his breath for a second. He listened intently through the sound of his own orchestra and caught it, a faint reverse motif on the verge of inaudibility. Chaos hadn't merely assembled the swarm. Chaos had stolen the very principle from him and was guiding its creature with its own melody. And its melody was fundamentally unfinished. It spun in a loop with no beginning and no end, and therefore it couldn't be overpowered simply by volume. The unfinished cannot be overwhelmed head-on by the finished. It can only be forcibly concluded. Chiron shouted to the orchestra to hold the third section in a loop for as long as their strength held out, while he himself ran down toward the stage to the black stone at the very center of the resonator. And as he ran, he realized he wouldn't have time to pick up the unfamiliar melody by ear. He needed the notes from the other side, and only the dead know such notes. He leaped into the center of the stage, and the black stone beneath his boots was as cold as ice. That was exactly when it happened. From the cold of the black stone, a violin sound rose to meet his despair. There wasn't a single violin in the city. The sound came from beneath the stage, from the depths of the 7 veins. It rose higher and higher, and along with it, she rose from the stone. A translucent woman in a concert gown reminiscent of a lost civilization, with a moonlight-colored violin at her shoulder. You could see the stars through her. From her seat, Evine cried out that this was no creature, that it was the mistress, that the amphitheater had never been empty throughout the ages. The ghostly violinist lowered her bow, looked at Chiron with eyes full of millennia of boredom, and said in a voice like a string that she had listened to silence for 300 years and to him for 3 months. She was more tired of the silence. She called herself Viela, the first violinist of the last orchestra, Ahorna. On the night her civilization drowned in chaos, she died on this stage without finishing the concert, and the unfinished music would not let her cross over. She said she could hear the motif of the flock's heart as clearly as Chiron could hear his own pulse, because the other side was now her home, and she raised her bow. Chiron didn't waste a single unnecessary word. He asked only if she could lead, and he would build the finale around her voice. Viela smiled for the first time in 300 years. They began play together as the city burned before their eyes. Viella plucked the circular motif of chaos from the other side, note for note, and led it on her moonlight-lit violin. Chiron picked up that endless circle with his citra and began to do with it what he had done throughout his past life with other people's themes. He gave it a beginning. He unfolded the circle into a line. The orchestra above understood the plan and laid the foundation with all 60 voices. Selena swirled the wind into a funnel and lifted their combined sound over the walls, straight into the heart of the flock. The flock's heart skipped a beat for the first time. Its circular song suddenly received a beginning it had not asked for, and everything that has a beginning must have an end. Chiron led the foreign motif toward its cadence, just as one leads a stubborn bull toward the gate. The creatures on the walls twitched in disarray. The living staircases crumbled, and on the final beat, what Viella had been waiting 300 years for happened. She began to play the finale of that very concert she had not finished on the night of Ahorn's death. Chiron heard the theme, picked it up, and together they completed the two unfinished pieces at once. Her and his piece from today. A golden wave surged not from the stage, but from all 7 veins at once, from beneath the entire bowl. It swept through the valley for 3 versts. The pack's heart burst silently, and 4,000 bodies, having lost all will, sank to the ground in heaps of motionless flesh that immediately began to melt like snow. And from the heaps, little lights rose, hundreds of pale lights, the souls devoured by the pack over the years. Viella drew her bow, and the little lights formed a slow circle above the city. The people on the walls stood in silence, their heads tilted back. Brant lowered his sword. Drops dripped from its jagged blade. Ulbert sat down right on the stones of the rampart, wiped his face with his palm, and said that he would never again in his life argue with musicians. By dawn, the lights had faded into the brightening sky, but Viella remained. She stood at the center of the stage, translucent in the first rays of light, and told Chiron that for the first time in 300 years, she didn't want to return to the stone. Chiron replied that the stage was hers and had always been hers, and that as of tonight, he was only the second voice in this hall. The system summarized the results. A pack-class invasion had been repelled. 19,000 threads of response had been received from the city and the surrounding lights. The carrier's level had been raised to 9. Chiron listened to the end and allowed himself to sit down on the edge of the stage. The respite lasted 1 scene, as it should. An hour after dawn, the signal for strangers was sounded from the eastern tower. A detachment of 30 lances, flying a black and red banner with a silver crown, was approaching the gates of Cantora. Brant glanced at the banner and spat. He said those were the colors of Baron Malric, lord of the eastern foothills, a man who owned 12 fortresses, commanded 8,000 soldiers, and had a habit of taking whatever wasn't secured. The horsemen stopped 100 paces from the gates. A herald in a lacquered breastplate rode forward, unfurled a scroll, and spoke with a voice as fine as that of a singer. He proclaimed that Baron Malric graciously informed the singing city of its coming under his rule. He proclaimed that the city must pay 1/3 of all its revenues into the Baron's treasury and hand over the city's master of songs to serve at the Baron's court. 3 days were granted for consideration. The herald rolled up the scroll, surveyed the walls, and added, without the scroll, with a smirk, that the Baron already had 1 songbird in a golden cage at court, and that the cage was large enough for 2. For 3 days, Cantora buzzed like an out-of-tune string. Gottfried believed they had to pay because the city wouldn't survive a war with 8,000 soldiers immediately after the battle with the pack. Brant believed they couldn't pay because whoever paid the Baron 1/3 would pay half a year later and give up their daughters 2 years later. Selena suggested lifting the herald a verse into the air on the wind and asking his opinion from up there. Chiron listened to everyone while thinking to himself about the words concerning the songbird. Yvain noticed this on his face, sat down next to him, and quietly said that she would sing about the cage herself without him asking. Chiron forbade it. Yvain sang anyway, and then couldn't get up for a whole day. But the vision was worth it. The entire city council saw the throne room of the Baron's fortress. Malric turned out to be a heavyset man with intelligent, cold eyes and rings on every finger. And at the foot of the throne, suspended by a silver chain, stood a woman whose appearance made Chiron's jaw drop. Tall, with the bearing of a column. A golden collar set with a ruby encircled her throat, and when she opened her mouth, the hall in the vision trembled. She sang, and the Baron's 8,000 soldiers in the fortress courtyard instantly doubled the speed of their drill movements. Her voice empowered the people just as bellows fan a fire. Yvain added the final detail in a hoarse voice. The collar forces her to sing and won't let her finish a single song. The Baron forbids complete forms because he fears their power. The woman's name is Arissa. Before the collar, she was known as the Voice of the Coast, and her opera was heard throughout the 3 kingdoms. Chiron stood up and told the council that he was going to the Baron himself. The council shouted in unison. Brant slammed his fist on the table and demanded at least 100 guards. Chiron refused. 8,000 soldiers cannot be breached by 100. Such fortresses are not taken by the sword. Such fortresses are taken from the stage. He took 3 people with him, Selena with her harp, Viella, who during the day could fit into his shadow, and Brant, who said that either he went or Chiron would have to step over his dead body. At dawn on the 4th day, they set out for the foothills under a white flag of truce, and that in itself was an answer to the Baron that the city would not pay 1/3 of the ransom. The road to the fortress was a series of outposts, 2 days through the foothills. There were checkpoints every 10 versts. The soldiers at the checkpoints stared at the citru on Chiron's back and snickered. On the 3rd day, the gates of Malgard Fortress swallowed them whole. Malric received them in that very throne room from the vision. Arissa stood chained to the throne, and up close, Chiron noticed something the vision had not shown. Beneath the collar, her skin was worn down to scars. The Baron eyed his guests with the playful curiosity of a cat facing mice. He said he was glad to see the Master of Songs so soon, and that he was willing to forgive the city's audacity if the Master chose to remain at court of his own free will. Chiron replied that he had come to propose something else, a contest. His music against whatever the Baron put forward. If the Baron won, Chiron would put on a second collar without resistance. If Chiron won, Arissa would leave with him, and Cantora would pay no one, ever. The hall fell silent. Malric was the first to laugh, and he laughed for a long time. Then he wiped his eyes with his rings and agreed, because he couldn't refuse in front of the court. He set the terms himself. Tomorrow at noon in the fortress courtyard, in front of the entire garrison. Representing the Baron are his 9 full-circle battle runecasters. The one who first loses control of his art, loses. The night before the contest, Chiron didn't sleep. He lay in his assigned cubicle and listened to the fortress. And after midnight, he heard what he had been hoping for. A song drifted faintly down the chimney from the upper floors. Arissa was singing alone in her cage, and the song kept breaking off mid-phrase, over and over, because the collar was choking her just as she began to sing. It was like listening to a person who was being prevented from taking a breath deeper than halfway. Chiron pressed his palm against the cooled-down fireplace and quietly, very quietly, played the continuation of her cut-off phrase on the zither. Exactly the note where the collar had cut her off, and 4 more after that. It grew very quiet upstairs. Then the song began again and broke off at the same spot. And Chiron picked it up again and carried it on. So they played a game of call and response through the chimney until the 3rd cockcrow, without ever exchanging a single word. By morning, Arissa knew his style as one knows a handwriting, and he knew her breathing as one knows one's own instrument. Noon struck, the sun beating down on the courtyard. 8,000 soldiers stood along the walls and galleries. Malric sat beneath the canopy and chained Arissa at his feet like a living banner. 9 spellcasters stood in a circle. The eldest among them, wielding a black iron staff, bowed to the Baron and declared that he would show the singing vagabond what becomes of art without a charter. The spellcasters began. 9 staffs traced a blazing net in the air, and the net closed in on Chiron like a contracting dome. The air inside the dome thickened. Sound in the thick air died before it was even born. A clever move. They weren't suffocating the musician, they were suffocating the environment. Selena stepped forward and plucked the strings of her harp. A gust of wind burst from her hands, splitting the thick air, and the dome burst at the seams. The spellcasters regrouped and struck again. From the 9 staffs came a single, continuous, howling tone, without pitch or melody. A wolfish tone that devoured any melody just as ripples devour hills. Chiron began to play and heard his theme drowning. The notes emerged from the zither and died 2 steps away. Laughter rippled through the galleries. Malric, on the throne, folded his hands over his stomach. And then Chiron did what he'd stayed up all night to do. He stopped playing the theme. He began to play the accompaniment. A bare accompaniment without a melody. A foundation without a house. An empty frame without a stone. The wolf's howl had nothing to devour in the accompaniment, and the chanters were momentarily thrown off balance. And the setting called out to the stone. The figures of the accompaniment led, time and again, to that very phrase. To the phrase from the chimney. To the soaring note that had been cut short halfway through all night long. And Arissa, at the foot of the throne, raised her head. Chiron saw her eyes and guided the setting toward that soaring note. She opened her mouth. The collar flashed ruby red and squeezed her throat mid-breath, just as it had for years. But that night, they had already learned to carry her phrase forward. Viella stepped out of Chiron's shadow, standing full length in full view of all 8,000, and her moonlit violin picked up Arissa's voice exactly at the point where it broke off, and carried the phrase onward, not letting it die. The collar squeezed her throat, but the song was already living outside her throat. Arissa clung to that violin string like a drowning person to a rope and followed it upward with her voice. The ruby on the collar tinkled. Chiron on the zither, Selena on the harp, Viella on the violin, they held a complete form around her voice from all sides, just as walls around a flame. Only one final interval remained before the tonic, before the first complete phrase in years of captivity. Malric understood everything a beat before the others. He leaped from the throne and bellowed at the guards to cut down the musicians. Too late. Arissa hit the tonic. The first complete phrase of the coastal voice struck the courtyard of Malgard, and the golden collar shattered into 7 pieces along with the ruby. And following it came her own power, which the collar had held in her throat for years. Arissa's voice unleashed its full might, and the 8,000 soldiers who had raised their weapons froze. Her singing empowered the people, but every form of empowerment has a downside. She sang of defeat. She sang of weakness. The knees of the 8,000 buckled at once. Swords rained down onto the courtyard stones with a clatter like hail. The 9 spellcasters fell beside their staffs. Malric himself slid off the throne and remained sitting on the steps, gasping for air. Only 5 remained standing in the courtyard. Chiron, Selena, Viella, Brant, with a sword he'd never needed, and Arissa, standing over the shards of the collar. She turned to Chiron and spoke her first words of the day. She told him he'd won the contest, and that now he should just try singing without her. They left Malgard walking, not running, because there was no one to run from. At the threshold, Chiron turned to the Baron sitting on the steps and said that Cantora doesn't pay anyone. Malric remained silent, but the fear was gone from his eyes. His eyes were calculating. They took a shortcut back across the pass, and at the crest of the pass, Yvain was waiting for them, standing there even though she was supposed to be lying in the city. Her face was the color of ash. She said she had sung again without being asked and that the vision was brief. Malric sent bone doves to all 12 fortresses the very moment the gates closed behind them. He is mustering all 8,000 men and hiring weavers from the guild who have been waiting 300 years for a reason to extinguish the wild spring. The guild and the Baron reached an agreement in a single evening. The combined army will march on Cantora in 10 days, and from the south, a second flock will approach the city during those same days because the vortex in the lands of chaos did not die along with the heart. It was nurturing a new one. Chiron stood at the crossroads between these two pieces of news, gazing down at the distant golden glow of his city. Orissa stood to his left, Selena to his left, Viella in his shadow. Yvain took him by the sleeve. He asked the 4 women and himself whether a single city of music would be enough to stand against an army of men and an army of chaos at the same time. No one answered. Down in the valley, the wind carried the evening singing of a children's choir from the walls of Cantora. 10 days is very little time when 8,000 soldiers are advancing from the north with the weavers, and a new horde is gathering from the south. Chiron returned to Cantora at night, and by morning, the city already knew everything. There was no panic, which surprised even him. The people who had survived the gray ripples and the creature's nighttime assault had forgotten how to scatter. They gathered in the amphitheater's bowl and waited to hear what the man on the black stage would say. Chiron spoke briefly. The city won't flee because there's nowhere to run from here. The city will perform. There's no need to describe the 10 days of preparation day by day, so here are 4 snapshots. Snapshot 1. Orissa took the entire city as her choir. She selected 4,000 voices from among the 20,000 residents and drove them from dawn until dusk. She explained that her power grows with every voice that sings in harmony with her, and that 4,000 voices would transform her song of amplification into a song for an entire army. By the 3rd day, the choir had taken on simple forms. By the 6th day, the flags on the towers were trembling from their singing. Cut 2. Ulbert and his stonemasons, following Chiron's orders, were cutting resonance wells into 7 stone veins. Chiron instructed him to ensure that a blow to the stone at the center of the stage would be felt physically at any point in the city, even in the most remote. Ulbert didn't ask why. After his night with the flock, Ulbert had stopped asking questions altogether. Cut 3. At night, Viella would disappear into the stone and return with notes from the other side. She listened to the distant vortex to the south and brought Chiron fragments of a new flock's motif. She didn't like the motif. She said that the new heart was learning and that fragments resembling phrases stolen from Chiron himself had appeared in its ring. Chaos was picking at it like a crow picks at something shiny. Scene 4. Chiron was writing. He had locked himself away on the top tier with his zither and sheet music, now produced by 3 city workshops, and was composing a symphony for a war on 2 fronts. 4 movements. A stone movement for the garrison, a wind movement for the walls, a vocal movement for Orissa with a choir, and the final movement, which he showed to no one, responding to questions only with silence. On the 5th day, a man from the enemy arrived in the city. The guards led a thin man in a gray weaver's cloak with the guild's insignia torn off to the stage. He introduced himself as Orvin, a 3rd circle master, and said he had deserted from the march. Brant suggested hanging him just in case. Orvin was not afraid. He said that for 14 years he had faithfully suppressed the wild springs because he believed that the wild power was tearing the world apart. He said that he had been marching with this army to subdue yet another savage, and during a rest stop, he heard from refugees how this savage was stopping the packs and removing their collars. He had come to see with his own eyes what he had been taught to hate. Chiron didn't try to convince him with words. He took Orvin to the school where Selena was teaching the children breathing exercises and left him there for the day. That evening, Orvin found Chiron on his own. The weaver's hands were trembling. He said that for 300 years the guild had been drawing walls of symbols, and the symbols died within an hour. He said that today he had seen an 8-year-old girl sing a blade of grass to life, and the blade of grass remained real forever. He asked permission to stay and offered the only thing he had. He knew the weaver's plan. He explained that the guild was bringing not symbols for battle to the city, but the Great Silence, a relic from the guild's earliest years. A network of bone pillars that forms a dome covering a verst of land and silences every sound within it. The weavers planned to set up the pillars at night, cover the city, and take it with their bare hands, because a mute musician is just a skinny guy with a stick. The council listened in silence. Selena asked how to break the silence if silence devours sound. Orwin replied that there was no way. In 300 years, no one had ever broken the dome from the inside. Instead of answering, Chiron stepped down onto the stage, placed his palm on the black stone, and asked Albert to strike the resonance well at the far edge with a sledgehammer. After 2 breaths, the stone beneath his palm gave a distinct jolt. Chiron raised his head and said that sound is not just air. The sound was also the stone. And the Charter of the Great Silence said nothing about the stone. On the 7th day, Brant's scouts returned from the south and the north, and the news landed on the table like 2 weights. The barons and the guild's army was advancing faster than expected and would reach the valley on the 9th day. The flock moved more slowly but steadily and was arriving at the same spot on the same day. Gottfried stared for a long time at the map, where 2 arrows converged on a single circle, and said that in his entire life, fate had never been so generous with shit. Yvain stood by the map longer than anyone else. Then she asked Chiron to listen to her without interrupting. She said that 2 on the same day was no coincidence. She could sense, deep down, that the funnel was stretching not toward the city, but toward the army. A living army of 8,000 bodies was like a granary to the pack. Chaos wasn't coming to devour Cantora. Chaos was coming to devour the Baron's army and was saving the city for dessert. Chiron looked at the map, and a cold realization clicked inside him, one he didn't like at all. All they had to do was close the gates and wait it out. The enemies would devour each other beneath the walls. He caught himself having that thought, looked at Arissa with the marks of a collar on her throat, and at Orvin with his scarred insignia, and realized that the Baron's army contained 8,000 such people in collars, only they were invisible. He rolled up the map and told the council that the plan was changing. Cantora would march out from behind the walls and take on the battle against a foreign army. But the council argued until midnight. Brant called it madness. Gottfried calculated how many of his own men would fall for strangers. Chiron waited for silence and explained the simple truth. If the pack devours 8,000 bodies, it will grow so large that no walls will help. Saving the enemy is not mercy. It is depriving chaos of its sustenance. And he would think about mercy after victory. On the 9th day, before dawn, the sentries on the northern towers sounded their horns, and immediately the horns fell silent. It was not an army creeping into the valley from the north. From the north, nothingness was creeping in. Birds fell from the sky, their silent beaks agape. The river flowed into an invisible boundary and ceased to murmur. The weavers did not wait for nightfall. Bony pillars rose around the valley while it was still dark, and the great silence engulfed Cantora entirely, along with the fields and the river. Chiron stood on the wall, shouting an order, yet he could not hear his own voice. Nearby, Brant cursed silently. Arissa opened her mouth, and for the first time since the collar had fallen, nothing came from her throat. Her face did not show fear. Her face showed such fury that Chiron felt a moment's pity for the weavers. He raised his hand, and the entire garrison saw the signal they'd been practicing for 10 days. Chiron placed his hand on the stone of the wall and tapped out the first rhythm of the stone section with his fingers. Deep beneath their feet in the resonance well, Ulbert and the masons struck their sledgehammers in response, and the city, which could no longer speak, began to pound. Stone spoke more slowly than air, but more truthfully. The rhythm from the wells spread through the 7 veins, and every resident of Cantora felt it in the soles of their feet and in their chests. The silent city did not crumble in panic, because the city still had a pulse. Chiron stood on the northern wall and surveyed the valley. The weavers marched behind a dome of silence in a formation of 9 wedges, each with 9 men carrying bone staffs before them. Behind them, the Baron's banners unfurled, and 8,000 of Malric's soldiers marched in complete silence, which was more terrifying than any battle cry. Malric himself rode in the center beneath a black and red banner, and even from such a distance, Chiron could see that the Baron was riding reluctantly. Since Malgard, the guild had held him by the throat with debts and a contract. The weavers made the first move. Halder was marching in the front wedge. Chiron recognized him by the way he held his head. The old man traced a chain of symbols in the air, and from the dome of silence, a small inner dome broke away and crept toward the walls on its own. Orvin, clinging to a crenel on the wall, silently moved his lips. Chiron understood without a word. The small dome suppressed the sound. The small dome imposed a rhythm. Overnight, the guild had come to understand the stone. The pulse in their veins began to slow, like footsteps in a swamp. And then Chiron tapped out the signal for the second part on the stone ahead of schedule. At this signal, on the far southern tier, 4,000 members of the choir laid their palms on the stone benches specially hewn by Ulbert benches and began, not to sing, but to breathe. Inhale for a count of 4. Exhale for a count of 4. 4,000 chests moving in unison. That too is music, and the dome didn't know what to make of it, because breath is neither sound nor beat. It is a form in and of itself. The small dome began to dance, stuttering between stone and breath, and in this dance, Selena found a crack. She didn't try to play. She stepped out onto the upper platform of the North Tower, raised her hands without a harp, and began to bend the wind itself. The wind doesn't need sound to exist. She gathered all the morning air above the valley and hurled it down the slope in a single, solid wave. The wave rolled along the line of bone pillars. The pillars were firmly anchored and would have withstood a battering ram. But Selena wasn't striking the pillars. She was striking the invisible membrane of the dome stretched between them, just as one would strike a sail with the palm of one's hand. 3 of the 40 pillars could not withstand the counterforce and burst at their bases. A breach 100 paces wide opened in the dome, and the sounds of the world poured into it. A river, birds, the wind, and the 4,000 voices of the choir that had been waiting for this moment for 10 days. Arissa stood on the southern tier, facing the breach, and struck the first note at the very moment the air learned to carry it once more. The choir rallied to her voice like an army to a banner. The song of empowerment flowed through the breach outward, spreading over the valley, and Chiron felt his own hands fill with a foreign, generous power. The garrison on the walls stood at attention all at once. But the song was not directed at the garrison. Orissa directed it at the Baron's army. The 8,000 soldiers marching to destroy her city suddenly heard a voice that sang strength to them. Not fear, not weakness as in Malgard, strength and clarity. And with a clear mind, a person begins to think, and 8,000 minds simultaneously thought a simple thought. Why are we here? The ranks broke. Halder assessed the threat instantly. The weavers struck with all 9 wedges and patched the breach with a new membrane. On top of it, they burned a sign into the sky that Orwin recognized from the wall and turned pale. He grabbed a piece of coal and wrote a single word on the stone. Harvest. The guild had used the harvest symbol 3 times in 300 years. It did not protect. It sucked the life force from everything living in the vicinity and fed it to the dome. The grass beneath the troops' feet turned yellow before their very eyes. The river by the pillars froze over in the middle of the summer. The dome of silence filled with a murky light and began to close in on the city like a fist. And at that moment, sentries from the south let out a cry, and their cry could be heard because the southern side of the breach was still breathing. A pack was entering the valley from behind the ridge. Its new heart had made it larger than before. Brant counted from the tower and stopped after 10,000 bodies. The swarm cut straight into the rear of the Baron's army. The rear banners were crushed within a minute. The creatures made no distinction between the banners. 8,000 soldiers found themselves trapped between the closing dome of their own weavers and 10,000 gaping maws. Halder made the guild's choice without hesitation. The weavers' wedges unfurled the sign of the harvest and began to draw strength from their own perishing troops to hold the dome in place. From the tower, Chiron watched as Malric's soldiers fell to their knees between a rock and a hard place, and as the Baron fought his way through the ring of creatures, now without any banner at all. And Chiron struck the stone, signaling the 4th part, the one he had never shown to anyone. The gates of Cantora opened from the inside. No army emerged from the gates because there was no army at the city. An orchestra emerged from the gates, 60 musicians with their instruments. Behind them was a choir of 4,000. Behind them came Chiron with a silver zither and Orissa, Selena, and Viella in his shadow. Brant, with 100 guards, flanked this mad procession, and his face was that of a man carrying out an order in defiance of everything he knew about war. They emerged from beneath the dome through the southern breach into the open field between the city and the slaughter. And Chiron began the 4th movement. The 4th movement was a march, but not a march for his own people. Chiron had composed it over 10 nights, stealing hours from sleep for a foreign army. The melody carried within it everything a soldier who had been sold out feels. The weariness of the campaigns, the smoke of home, the faces of those who wait. And over it all, a single simple musical idea that any man with a weapon understands without words. You have been betrayed by those behind your back. Your enemy isn't where they drove you. Orissa lifted this march with her voice and the choir to such a height that all 8,000 heard it through the clanging and clatter. And the Baron's army broke ranks, not into flight, in the opposite direction. The soldiers, from whom the weavers had sucked the life away for the sake of the dome, turned their spears and charged the bone pillars of their own employers. The first pillar was toppled at once by dozens of hands. The dome trembled all around its circumference. Halder screamed silently within his own silence and traced symbols, but the harvest choked because there was no one left to harvest. The living had stepped out of its circle. The dome of the great silence did not burst from sound. It burst because it had been abandoned, no longer fed. For 300 years, the relic had suppressed a foreign voice and died of starvation. The sound returned to the valley all at once, the roar of the pack, the screams of people, the clang. and above it all, the cantora orchestra, which did not pause for a single beat. Chiron led the procession straight into the thick of the chaos among people and beasts, and the music marched before them like a battering ram. The beasts recoiled from the perfect forms as if from fire. The people, drawn to the perfect forms, rushed toward them as if toward a fire. Within a quarter of an hour, the battlefield had been reshaped. The baron's routed army was streaming toward the walls of Cantora under the cover of the march, while the pack lingered at the edge of the sound, devouring, for now, only their own wounded. 2 of Malric's guards carried him out of the rubble. The baron had been wounded in the thigh, had lost his horse and the crown of his self-assurance, but he was alive. They laid him down at the city gates he had been marching to capture. He looked up at Chiron, and there was no longer any calculation in his eyes. In his eyes was pure, unclouded horror born of understanding. Halder did not retreat. The old man stood alone amid the toppled pillars. The weaver's looms lay scattered in every direction. He straightened up, looked at the edge of the flock approaching him, then at the city, and he walked toward the gates of Cantora, leaning heavily on his staff. At the gates, he stopped directly across from Chiron. 300 years of the guild lay behind him as ashes. He said he had been wrong about one thing and right about another. Wrong in thinking that the wild must not be let into the world. Right in thinking that everyone around pays the price for a blazing bonfire. He pointed his staff south. The pack at the edge of the valley stopped devouring the wounded. 10,000 bodies froze at once and turned their heads toward the city. And then, from the center of the pack, a sound rose that should not have existed. The pack began to sing, in unison, and the song had a beginning. The pack's song crept across the valley, and it made the blood run cold, not because it was terrifying. It was perfect. 10,000 voices wove a melody with a beginning, a development, and the promise of an end. Chaos was no longer spinning in a circle. Chaos had learned the lesson that Chiron had taught it on the night of the first assault. Viella stepped out of the shadows, and her face was whiter than her own transparency. She said she heard her own phrases in this song, as well as Chiron's and Erissa's from Malgard. The new heart wasn't just picking out the brilliant parts. It was learning from each of their performances. For 3 months, they had been teaching Chaos the art of composition. Orwin was the first to grasp the mechanics of what was about to happen. He shouted that a completed form solidifies reality, anyone's. If the pack finished singing their form to the end, it would solidify not order, but themselves. Chaos would become the law across the entire solidified area, and no music would ever be able to pry it out of there. They had exactly until the end of the stranger's song. Chiron listened to the enemy's form with a professional ear and calculated its length. 3 parts. The pack was finishing the first. Judging by the density of the composition, it would take about half an hour. Half an hour to accomplish the impossible. He gathered everyone who was at the gates, his own people and yesterday's enemies, all mixed together. And he asked Halder how many weavers were still fit for battle. Halder replied that there were 41 men under his command. Chiron said that the Wild Source was asking the guild for an alliance for half an hour. The old man looked at him for a long time. Then he silently bowed his head. Chiron had built his plan around the single weakness he'd heard in the pack's song. The song was pieced together from stolen fragments, phrases from Viella, phrases from Erissa, and his own phrases. The stolen heart did not understand what it was singing. It merely repeated. And one who merely repeats cannot respond to a variation. Chiron explained his plan in 2 minutes. They would not drown out someone else's song, nor would they shout over it. They would blend into it. The orchestra, the choir, and all the singers among the 8,000 soldiers would take up the pack's melody note for note, just as they had picked up Arissa's phrase through the chimney. And then Chiron would begin to steer the collective song off course with variations. Slowly. Half-a. The heart stands at a crossroads. Either let go of its form and break away into the circle, admitting defeat, or follow the variations to the end. And the ending will no longer be written by it. Halder added, on behalf of the guild, the one thing the weavers knew how to do that the musicians did not. 41 weavers will construct, not a wall, but a channel out of symbols. A trough along which the unified sound will flow precisely into the center of the flock without dispersing. Selena said she would give this channel the wind as its current. Arissa simply asked which note to start on. They joined in on the second part of a foreign song. 4,000 choir members and the orchestra, along with 3,000 soldiers' voices, took up the flock's motif in unison with the flock itself. The flock didn't grow wary because it heard its own song. 10,000 creatures and 7,000 people sang a single melody across the valley to one another, and the sound made the chests of those standing in silence tighten. At the 15-minute mark, Chiron began to lead them away. The first variation was almost indistinguishable, a flourish at the end of the phrase. The heart repeated the flourish. The second variation shifted the harmony down a half tone. The heart hesitated and followed. Chiron led as one leads a fish on a thin line. One sudden jerk and the line would snap. One moment of slack and the fish would get away. He was pulling someone else's song from its natural course into his own, along the surface. Viella walked beside his zither, a violin made of moonlight, weaving notes from the song's innermost depths into each variation so that the heart would find it familiar and not be afraid. Arissa held 7,000 human voices in perfect harmony because a single off-key note would have exposed the substitution. By the 25th minute, the flock's song no longer belonged to the flock. The overall form moved where Chiron was composing it on the fly, and he led it toward a cadence the heart did not know. The cadence was set up like a trap. The resolution to the tonic lay across an interval that exists only in completed forms of order. Chaos was physically incapable of singing it while remaining chaos. At the 28th minute, the heart understood. Chiron sensed that moment of understanding just as a fisherman senses a tug. The entire flock tried all at once to tear the song back into the circle, and it couldn't. 7,000 voices and the orchestra and the weaver's trough and Selena's wind held their form as tightly as ropes hold a mast in a storm. The heart floundered within its own stolen song. It tore at the melody, but the melody wouldn't tear. It swallowed phrases, and the people sang the phrases to completion for it. He had 2 measures left before the interval that meant death to him. And then it did the last thing its stolen mind had the strength for. It fell silent, hoping to break the form with silence. Chiron was waiting for this. For this very occasion he had Yvain. She had stood silently by his side throughout the entire battle as he had ordered, and now he turned to her and nodded. Yvain stepped forward and sang the solo for that very penultimate measure, giving the song a day of her life, and then, without a pause, the second measure, giving a second day. Her cracked voice carried through the deathly silence all the way to the back rows of the flock. And over the valley, her song coalesced into a vision, just as it always did. Everyone saw what was to come. Everyone, including the heart. The vision showed the valley as it would be in a minute. A completed cadence, a golden wave, and an empty space where the flock had stood just moments before. The heart saw its own death a beat before it happened, and in that moment of utter, alien horror, Chiron, Viella, Arissa, and 7,000 voices took the final interval and resolved the form to the tonic. A golden wave swept across the valley from ridge to ridge. It did not burn the creatures as it had before. It dissolved them. Their fused bodies unraveled at the seams into their original threads, and the threads melted away. 10,000 creatures settled into the grass as gray dew, and the dew dried up by noon. From the center of the former flock rose a single pillar of sparks, thousands of souls, and Viella played a path for them upward until the last one had melted away. The silence that followed was so profound that one could hear Baron Malric weeping at the gate. He wept silently, ashamed, and could not stop. The battle's toll was tallied by evening. Of the Baron's 8,000 soldiers, 5,500 survived. 190 men from the Cantora garrison were killed, and the city dug its first mass grave. Of the 41 weavers, 38 survived the slaughter. Halder stood by the grave next to Chiron and said that the guild, in its former form, had at noon today. He removed the Grand Master's bone seal from his belt and held it out to Chiron. Chiron did not take the seal. He said that the city did not need the guild to surrender. The city needed a guild that would teach, not suppress. He offered Halder a seat on the council and a school of signs next to the music school. The old man held the seal in his open palm for a very long time. Then he put it away and, for the first time since they'd met, bowed first. That night, Chiron went up to see Evine. She was lying in her room at the school, and Selena hadn't left her side. In a single battle, Evine had sacrificed 11 days of her life to the songs, including the time spent on reconnaissance, and her hair had grown grayer. She wasn't sleeping. She was staring at the ceiling with her silver eyes, and when Chiron sat down beside her, she said quietly that she had to confess something. The vision of the cadence she'd shown everyone wasn't the whole story. She'd seen more, and she'd cut the song short before the vision had reached its end. Chiron asked what happened next. Evine replied that what came next was the vortex. The vortex in the south had neither died nor fallen asleep. The vortex had been watching their victory all this time, just as a teacher watches a test. And at the very end of the vision, the vortex began to shape out of the chaos, not a flock, nor a heart. It began to shape a hall. Stone tiers, a circular stage, an exact replica of Ehorn turned inside out. Chaos was building its own amphitheater. And on the inside-out stage stood someone who looked very much like a human, holding something that looked very much like an instrument. After the battle in the valley, the world stopped pretending that Cantora didn't exist. There's no need to describe the month following the victory day by day, so here are 4 snapshots. Snapshot 1. 5,500 of the Baron's soldiers were given the choice to go home with provisions or to stay. 4,000 remained, and over the course of a month, Brant transformed them from a mercenary force into the city guard with a charter that began with the words, "In Cantora, weapons serve those who cannot speak for themselves." Malric handed over promissory notes for all 12 fortresses to the city in exchange for a position under Gottfried. At first, the elder scoffed, but then he realized that the Baron could calculate faster than 3 scribes combined, and that his eyes were once again calculating, but now in the city's favor. Scene 2. Halder, along with 38 weavers, opened a school of symbols on the western tier. His first act was to publicly burn the guild's charter in the square, and the city's elders wept as they watched the bonfire, for many had once fled precisely because of the bone seals. Orvin became the school's second master and devised a way to weave symbols with musical notation so that Chiron's scores could now be etched into stone for eternity. Third scene. Embassies began arriving in the city. The first to arrive was a caravan from the maritime kingdom of Velmar, bearing a trade proposal and singing birds as a gift for Orissa, a gesture she considered a subtle mockery, and for 3 days she refused to meet with the envoys. Following Velmar came the mountain principalities, then the steppe khanate, and finally even an embassy from those very 7 cities whose charter had once declared the wild springs to be outlawed. They all brought the same things: gifts, pleas, and fear. The chaos beyond the secured lands grew more intense with each passing week, and everyone wanted to buy a little bit of true peace from Cantora. Cut 4. Chiron reached the 12th level, and the system unlocked the long-range anchor function for him. Now, the completed form, etched with Orvin's symbols in stone and activated on site, anchored the land without Chiron's personal presence. The first 3 long-range anchors were set in the foothills of Malric and along the road to Velmar. On Gottfried's map, a golden spot was spreading around Cantora, and a merchant from Velmar, looking at the map, uttered a phrase that the entire city would later repeat. He said that this was no longer a city, it was a civilization. But all of this was the bright side of the moon, and the moon also had a dark side. Reports from the borders of the golden spot landed on the council's table every week, and there was a pattern to them. The chaos beyond the border wasn't just intensifying. It was intensifying the more the gold spread. Halder was the first to voice aloud what everyone was afraid to think. The world is like a blanket. If you pull the blanket over yourself, someone at the other end will freeze. Each of their anchors pushed the chaos outward, and somewhere beyond the horizon, villages they would never see were perishing because of it. The refugees confirmed this. People were now coming to Cantora not by the hundreds, but by the thousands, and their stories were all the same. Where they came from, reality was tearing apart faster than anyone living could remember. Chiron listened to these stories week after week and realized that he hadn't built a refuge, he had built a pump. And then he went to see Viella. The conversation took place at night on an empty stage, and Chiron began with a question he'd been putting off since day 1. He asked what kind of concert Ehorn had been playing on the night of his death. Viella was silent for a long time. The moon violin in her hands lay like a sleeping beast. Then she told him everything. 300 years ago, Ehorn was the pinnacle of the civilization of sound. 7 stone veins, 7 great halls, and an ambition worthy of the gods. Ehorn's masters composed the world score. A single symphony of such completeness that its conclusion was meant to secure not a city or a valley, but the entire world once and for all. Chaos was weak back then and lived on the fringes of existence like mold in the corners. The score was written over 40 years. The performance was scheduled for a single night, simultaneously in all 7 halls. Viella played first violin in the main hall. She remembered every measure of that night. The symphony reached its final movement, and the world had already begun to ring out, solidifying across the entire circumference of the horizon. And then the 4th hall made a mistake. A single musician in the 4th hall played the wrong interval. A tiny crack, half a tone wide, and the entire world score collapsed into that crack. An unfinished form of such power did not simply come to an abrupt end. It turned inside out. All the power that was meant to hold the world together became a force that undermines it. The symphony continued to play, but now inside out, and it still plays to this day. The vortex in the south is not a nest of chaos. The vortex is the 4th hall of Ehorn turned inside out, where a dead orchestra has been playing an inverted symphony for 300 years, unable to either finish it or stop. The chaos of the entire world is simply an echo of their eternal mistake. Chiron listened, and the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. Why does chaos gravitate toward his music? Why does it learn specifically from him? Why is it building an amphitheater? The inside wasn't at war with him. The inside recognized kin in him. Another orchestra, another symphony. He asked Viella if it was possible to complete the world score now. She replied that the inverted form could only be completed from within. He must enter the hall of the inside, stand among the dead orchestra, catch the symphony in its eternal cycle, and play the final movement without a single mistake. The final movement for 7 voices and a full orchestra. A half-tone error had already cost the world once. A second error would leave not even the inside. And then she added the most important thing, gazing into the darkness of the hall past Chiron. The notes of the final movement were not preserved anywhere up there. The score was destroyed by the collapse itself. Only those who played it that night remember the finale in its entirety. The dead of the 4th hall, who are now playing it inside out. And her. Viella, the first violinist, remembered the finale in its entirety, down to the very last note, because for 300 years trapped in stone, she had nothing else to do but repeat it to herself. She said she would go with him into the vortex and that she most likely wouldn't return from there. A ghost is held in the world by unfinished music. On the night the world score is completed, her own unfinished concert will end along with it. The end of the world will be her dissolution. She said this matter-of-factly, without complaint, as if stating the time. Chiron sat on the edge of the stage for a very long time. Then he said he would not accept such a price. Viella smiled her once every 300 years smile and replied that he was not the one setting the price here. The council convened the next day, and Chiron laid everything out. The truth about the pump. The truth about the funnel. The plan to march south into the heart of the inside with an orchestra large enough for the 7-voice finale. The council was silent for so long that you could hear the children in the square singing in thirds. Brent was the first to stand up and say he would go. Then Selena. Then Arissa. Then Halder said that weavers know how to build channels, and that would come in handy in the inside. Gottfried and Malric stayed behind to hold the city, and Malric, for the first time in his life, gave something away for free. He gave away the entire treasury of the 12 fortresses for the expedition. The preparations took 20 days, and on the 21st, a procession unlike anything the world had ever seen emerged from the southern gates. 120 musicians in the orchestra, 300 voices in the small choir, 40 weavers, 500 of Brant's guards, wagons carrying instruments sheltered as if they were sacred relics. Yvain stood at the gate with a travel bag, and to all of Chiron's objections, she replied with a single phrase. She said that a blind woman who sees the hidden side of a journey is more useful than the sighted on such a journey, and that if he left her here, she would follow on her own. Chiron gave in. The city saw them off with a song. 20,000 people stood on the terraces and walls, singing a simple traveling song that Chiron had written back in the first week of construction. The column marched south, and the song lingered in the air behind them for 3 versts. And when it died down, Viella caught up with Chiron at the head of the column and said she had to give him something ahead of time. As they walked, she began to hum the final part of the world score to him, measure by measure, so that at least one living soul would remember the finale. In the 3rd week of their journey, the golden patch came to an end, and the column entered the lands of free chaos. And from the very first step across the border, it became clear that the other side was waiting for them. The path south had been cleared for them. In the midst of the seething chaos lay a perfectly straight corridor of solid ground, exactly as wide as their column, leading straight to the vortex like a red carpet to the stage. The corridor was worse than any attack. The column marched along a smooth, solid strip, while 10 paces to the left and right, the world behaved like paint on water. The hills breathed. The sky sometimes seemed to be below them. At night, creatures gathered by the hundreds along the corridor, but did not attack. They sat in rows along the edge and watched the column the way an audience watches a stage from the darkness of a theater. On the 3rd night, Brant said he would have preferred an assault. He understood what an assault entailed. A path to the crater built step by step. 8 days through the corridor. On the 2nd day, the chaos began to fall in step with their march, and the ground of the corridor bounced to the rhythm of their marching song. On the fourth day, the creatures along the border began to echo the chorus's call and response, at first out of sync, then more in unison. On the sixth day, Yvain stopped sleeping because, in her words, the other side was buzzing like a theater before a premiere. On the eighth day, the corridor began to slope downward and led them to the edge of a funnel. The funnel turned out not to be a pit. The funnel turned out to be a hall. The columns stood on the upper tier of a gigantic amphitheater built from chaos and mirroring Ehorn, just as a reflection in black water mirrors a face. The tiers descended in wide rings, and the audience sat in the tiers. Thousands upon thousands of motionless figures molded from gray ripples into human-like shapes. They sat in the postures of listeners, some leaning forward, some leaning back, some with their hands clasped beneath their chins. Chaos had watched the world for 300 years and had learned what an audience hall looks like. And at the very bottom, at the base of the funnel, lay an upside-down stage, and on it an orchestra was playing. 40 figures bathed in a dim light, with instruments made of that same light. Ehorn's dead fourth hall. The sound of their playing rose up through the tiers, and at that sound, the people in the columns clamped their hands over their ears and then lowered their hands because their ears wouldn't help. The music wasn't traveling through the air. The upside-down symphony was beautiful and unbearable at the same time, like the face of a loved one turned inside out. Viella stood on the top tier and looked down at the stage for a very long time. Then she said quietly that she recognized them all. The second violinist, Moraine, who was afraid of the dark. The timpanist, Boga, who laughed louder than his timpani. The conductor, Master Clavel, who had spent 40 years writing the world score and was conducting it that night. And the farthest desk in the second violins, where a young man named Tavish sat. Viella spoke that name, and for the first time since they'd met, her voice faltered. She said that Tavish had been her student, that it was he who had played the wrong interval that night, and that he'd played it that way because, a beat before the mistake, he'd looked not at the sheet music, but at her. They began their descent at dawn, if one can call it dawn when the gray sky of the funnel brightens to the color of ash. The plan had been devised back in Cantora and refined along the way. Halder's weavers were setting up tiers of a channel that would gather the sound of the live orchestra and carry it down without loss. Selena maintains a dome of still air over the funnel because, according to calculations, the sound would be distorted and warped at the bottom. Arissa, with the choir, takes her place on the middle tiers and, at the decisive moment, gives the live musicians the strength to hold out through the finale. Yvain listens from the other side and gives a signal if the dead orchestra begins to alter the symphony's tempo. And Chiron, along with Viella and the orchestra, descends to the very bottom, onto the inverted stage, because one can only enter the symphony from there, from within, standing among the dead. The audience, a gray blur, turned their heads as the procession made its way down the aisles. Thousands of featureless faces watched the descent, and Brant walked with clenched teeth, his hand resting on his useless sword. The guards remained in a ring on the upper tier, and Chiron could see from the soldiers' faces that standing there and listening would be no easier than going down. The descent took an hour. With each ring, the inverted symphony grew denser, and on the lower tiers it already flowed through the body like a current through a swimmer. 2 musicians were led away halfway down. The flutist began to weep and started playing along with the inverted melody, and he was forcibly taken back upstairs. The old man with the bone pipe, the very same one from the first refugee camp, sat down on the steps and said he couldn't go any further. Chiron sat down beside him, and the old man looked at him with eyes full of shame. Chiron said there was no shame in this, and led him into the channel toward the weavers, where even a simple, steady note was needed. It was quiet at the bottom of the crater. That turned out to be the most terrifying part. All the power of the inverted symphony surged upward and outward from here, while at the very center there was a deathly stillness, like the eye of a storm. 40 figures, silhouetted in the dim light, played within 3 steps of him and made not a sound. Chiron stepped onto the inverted stage first. The black stone beneath his feet was warm. alive. He recognized this stone. The same rock as in Cantora, only turned inside out. The dead orchestra did not stop playing or turn their heads. Only the conductor, Master Clavel, slowly, very slowly, shifted his gaze from the non-existent score to the new arrivals. The face in the dim light was expressionless, but Chiron physically felt that gaze like a palm on a mountain. And in his mind, without words or sound, understanding dawned. This was how the other side spoke. It showed him a picture. The hall upstairs, a corridor through the chaos, a smooth path. And the meaning was simple. We were waiting. We've been listening to you for 3 years of your world. You know how to finish things. Finish us off. Chiron took a step forward to reply, and just then Master Clavel raised his hand, halting the invisible music. The inverted symphony did not come to an abrupt end. It hung suspended, like a wave that had been prevented from falling, and the entire world around the funnel froze along with it. The creatures on the tiers stopped moving. The ashen sky stood still. The other side held its breath. And in that pause, Clavel laid out the condition. Understanding came again without words, and it was such that Chiron grew cold. The other side recognized its own by a single trait: incompleteness. Everyone in the dead orchestra had died before finishing their part, and that made them the inside. A living person who had brought everything in their life to a close could not join their ranks. The symphony simply would not accept their voice. To enter the cycle of the inverted form and earn the right to complete it, one must bring their own unfinished music. The real one. The one that remains within you as a wound. And Clavel looked at Chiron because he sensed such a wound in him from the very beginning. A concert in a past life. The final movement that Chiron did not finish playing as he died at the piano in another world. He carried that fragment within himself through death, through rebirth, through all his victories, and thought he had buried it. The other side demanded that he open the grave. To play here, on this inverted stage, that very finale from that very point where the piece breaks off. To open his wound so that the symphony would acknowledge him as wounded, as one of their own. And only then would the 40 dead let the living into their circle. Viella, standing nearby, mouthed silently that this was only half a trap. The condition was real, but the open wound in the heart of the other side might never heal. If he began his old finale and failed to bring it to a close here, where everything strives to remain unfinished, then the chasm would become his very essence. He would not die. He will stand as the 41st conductor in the orchestra of the dead and play an inverted symphony for eternity. Chiron stood on a warm black stone between his 2 lives. Up above, in the tiers, 500 of the living waited, those who had come here for him. Below, 3 steps away, 40 of the dead waited, those who had come here 300 years before him. He took the silver zither from his shoulder. He checked the 7 strings, one by one, and he said aloud in the deathly silence of the eye of the storm that if he was going to finish playing, he would finish playing. The first note of his old finale fell upon the upside-down stage, and 40 figures in the dim light suddenly turned their heads toward him. The old finale began with a 4-measure introduction, and Chiron immediately realized he wasn't playing alone. The upside-down stage was playing along with him. The warm black stone caught every note and returned it with a nuance that Chiron hadn't intended, with a nuance of that night. He was conducting the finale from a past life, and the stage was drawing that very life out of him. By the 3rd phrase, the auditorium began to take shape around him. Not a funnel, another hall. The velvet of the armchairs, the spotlight, the scent of rosin and perfume from the front row. The other side was building the setting for his death around him, drawn from his own memory, and it was flawless. Chiron played and saw the rows of the audience from that final concert emerging from the gray light. Faces he had forgotten. The face of the woman in the third row who had already been crying at the overture. The face of the old teacher in the box who had come to hear his student one last time and didn't know that this was the last time in another sense. Chiron's fingers ran along the 7 strings, and his chest began to ache where his heart had burst that night. The other side was restoring more than just the hall. It brought back the circumstances. Viella stood at the edge of the stage and watched as the living musician faded. The color drained from his clothes, from his hair, from his hands. Chiron began to resemble the figures of the dead orchestra and was already playing within his own set, unable to see the vortex. The finale was heading toward the point of collapse. To that very same beat at which, in a past life, darkness had taken him away from the piano. And the closer that point came, the more the stage pressed him toward it. The other side didn't prevent him from playing. The other side helped him play right up to the cliff's edge, because the cliff's edge was its door. It didn't need a musician who played to the end. It needed a musician cut short. Console 41. Inside the set, Chiron felt this pressure like a headwind that had suddenly turned into a tailwind. Too much of a tailwind. The notes flowed easily, too easily. The pain in his chest grew with every measure, and it wasn't a memory. The reverse side faithfully reproduced that entire night, along with death. 5 measures before the cliff's edge, his left hand began to go numb, just as it had back then. 3 measures in, his vision darkened. 2 measures in, he heard someone in the audience stand up and shout for a doctor, and the voice was the very same one from that night. And on the last measure before the break, when his fingers were already forgetting the strings, a sound burst into his set, a sound that hadn't been there that night. A violin. Viella stepped into the unfamiliar hall that had opened up over the edge of the overturned stage, as one steps into a bonfire, and her moonlit violin settled beneath his voice as the second line. She didn't know his old finale. She couldn't have known it. But she had been the first violin for 300 years, and she read his playing a beat ahead, just as one reads a partner's breath. Her part didn't lead him. Her part stood beside him, and that was enough. The moment of the cliffhanger arrived. The heart in the set stopped, just as the script for that night dictated. But the music didn't stop. Chiron took the next measure, the measure he hadn't played in his past life. The fingers of his numb hand found the strings because the violin was playing nearby and holding a place for them. He stepped over his own death within her and moved forward through the notes he'd carried in his head for 40 years and had never once played aloud. The hall set shook. The other side didn't understand what was happening. The door to the precipice opened, and the man entering walked past it. Chiron was playing a part of his own finale that was unfamiliar even to himself, and with each measure, color returned to his hands. He brought the finale to its final page, raised it to the highest note, and resolved it to the tonic, just as he had dreamed of resolving his entire past life. The final chord fell. The concert hall's set crumbled silently like ash, and once again there was the upside-down stage, the ashen sky, and 40 figures in the dim light. Chiron stood in the middle of the crater, alive and unharmed, and for the first time in 2 lifetimes, there was no abyss inside him. He waited for the other side to explode with rage. The other side did something else. Maestro Clavel lowered his raised hand, and the upside-down symphony he had been holding aloft all this time remained suspended. The conductor from the dim light did something he hadn't done in 300 years. He placed a non-existent baton on a non-existent podium, and the 40 figures of the dead orchestra, one by one, lowered their instruments and bowed their heads before the man who, on their stage, had brought the unending to an end. The condition had been more than fulfilled. Chiron had come to them wounded and had been healed before their very eyes, and the underworld had never witnessed such a breakthrough. Clavel's understanding came as warmly as a handshake. The circle was open. A place in the symphony's cycle was now free for the living. A collective sigh swept through the tiers above, from the 500 people who had been staring down below, holding their breath for an hour. Chiron gave the signal, and the grand arrangement began. 120 living musicians descended to the bottom and took their places among the dead, console by console. A flute from Cantora stood next to a flute from the dim light. The living kettledrums stood beside Boga's kettledrums. Halder's weavers had brought the sound to the very bottom, and the sound from the upper tiers, where the choir and Arissa were waiting, now flowed onto the stage like a river into the sea. Viella walked to the first violin stand, to her seat. It had stood empty for 300 years because her body had died upstairs in the main hall, not here. She stood beside it, and 40 dead turned toward her like arrows pointing north. And then she looked at the farthest second violin desk. Tavish from the dim light hadn't raised his head from the very beginning. He was the only one of the 40 who didn't look at the newcomers or at her. The young man sat hunched over his instrument, and Chiron suddenly realized that for 300 years in this inverted symphony, this musician had played louder than anyone else. The dark side of it all rested on his shoulders more than anyone else's. Viella approached his music stand. She stood over her student for a very long time. Then she knelt down beside him, as one kneels beside the fallen, and spoke aloud the first words addressed to the dead. She said she had been watching him that night because she was proud of him. That for the measure leading up to his mistake, she had turned away from the sheet music because she wanted to see the face of her best student at the most crucial moment of his life. That the mistake was a shared one, his hand and her pride, and that she had come to finish playing their shared measure. A figure in the dim light raised its head. Tavish's face had no features like everyone else's here, but the funnel swayed. Across all the tiers, throughout the entire audience, a wave rippled through the gray haze like ripples on water. The upside-down symphony, suspended in mid-air, emitted a sound like a sob. Evayan, in the middle tier, shouted a warning. She shouted that the inside-out was losing its balance, that for 300 years, Tavish's guilt had been the nail on which the entire reversal of the symphony hung, and that Viella had just pulled that nail out. Nothing was holding the symphony in the air anymore. It began to fall, not in a reversal, but in a collapse. All the power of the inverted form, accumulated over 300 years, was scattered to the winds, and the ashen sky above the funnel cracked crisscross. Clavel leapt to the console. The realization struck him as sharply as a command. Play, immediately, from the turn. Catch the symphony in its fall and lead it to the finale, because there won't be a second chance. The collapse will devour both the inside and the world. 120 living and 40 dead raised their instruments. Viella took her place at her console next to Tavish's. Chiron took his place in the center, right at the conductor's podium, because he was the one who held the finale in his memory, and it was up to him to lead it. He raised his hand and saw that it wasn't trembling. The sky above the crater was splitting open. The audience, a gray blur, rose from their seats across all the tiers. Chiron lowered his hand, and 160 voices of the living and the dead joined the falling symphony all at once. Catching the falling symphony turned out to be just like catching a falling mountain. For the first 10 measures, the united orchestra was simply struggling to survive within the avalanche. The overturned form crumbled not by notes, but by boulders, and each boulder was a piece of music weighing 300 years. Chiron stood in the center and did the only thing he could. He listened to the entire avalanche and signaled with his hands where the next boulder would fall so that the orchestra could position the sound beneath it in time. The dead read his gestures faster than the living because they had lived 300 years within that music. The living kept the tune because they had spent 3 years within his school. On the 11th measure, Clavel caught Chiron's eye from the podium and conveyed an understanding. The collapse cannot be stopped from below. The collapse can only be ridden. Enter into its own momentum and, from within, transform the fall into a descent. In music, there is a name for this: a cadence. The entire collapse had to be transformed into a single gigantic descending cadence, as long as the remainder of the symphony, and guided out of the fall into the final movement, just as a horse is brought from a gallop to a walk. Chiron embraced this understanding and conveyed it to the orchestra in the only way available. He began to play himself. His silver zither traced a descending line across the collapse, and that line showed everyone the direction. Not to hold back. Go! The viola picked up the lead first and guided the violins down the precipice in broad terraces. The brass followed the violins. Behind the brass came the choir from the upper tiers through the weaver's channel. Arissa heard the plan across the entire funnel, and her voice settled over the general descent like a broad dome, preventing the ledges from crumbling into a mess. The collapse began to take shape. The boulders were no longer falling haphazardly, but down the steps that the orchestra built, one beat ahead of the fall. Selena, from above, pressed the spreading sound back into the funnel with a dome of still air, and Chiron could hear how difficult it was for her because the dome was trembling. The ashen sky continued to crack. From the cracks, something emerged that Evine later called the draft of being. The audience, a gray ripple across the tiers, began to pour into those cracks, drawn in by streams. The other side was losing its population. The chaos of the entire world flowed back into the funnel toward the mother of the symphony and was sucked into the fissures after the crowd. Halder shouted from the tiers through the channel that he could feel the ripples subsiding across all the lands outside. The collapse was devouring itself, and it was both good and terrifying, because along with the chaos, everything that was nearby. The two weavers would have been swept away if Brant hadn't ordered the guards to use a chain to hold the people on the tiers in place. The descending cadenza lasted 20 minutes, and Chiron conducted with his zither, realizing that for the second time in his life he was playing at the very limit of all 40 years of his mastery, and that the limit was near. The fingers of his left hand were rubbed raw against the strings until they bled, just as they had back then with the 4 strings against the wall of fog, only now no one saw the blood because there was no one to watch. Everyone was playing, and in the 21st minute, the fall ended. The symphony emerged from the collapse onto level ground. 160 voices and the choir held it aloft in its entirety, just as one holds a survivor in one's arms. There came a moment of silence within the music that all musicians of the world know. The moment before the final movement. Chiron looked at Viella. Viella looked at Tavish. And the three of them began the final movement of the world score. First violin, second violin, and the zither from another world. The finale that Viella had been repeating in stone for 300 years and had been instilling in Chiron for 3 weeks on their journey south was now unfolding in reality, and it was simpler than Chiron had expected. The masters of Ehorn, at the height of their pride, had not written the world's finale with thunder. They had written it as a homecoming. The theme flowed light and simple as a road song, and the orchestra joined in, voice by voice. The dead played, and something was happening with the figures in the dim light. Features began to emerge on their faces. Baga, behind the kettle drums, smiled. Moraine, from the second violins, wept with light. They were playing the finale they should have played 300 years ago, and every measure returned to them the night that had been stolen from them. The audience, a gray ripple, stopped trickling into the cracks. The remaining thousands of figures sat motionless, and where they had no faces, there was now something resembling faces. Chaos listened to his lullaby. The final section was building toward its climax, and that climax was that very fourth interval, that very measure from the fourth hall. The spot of the old mistake that had to be played again, and played flawlessly. Chiron led the orchestra toward it and saw how Viella tensed up and how Tavish's hunched figure straightened at his podium. The other side remembered this place too. The ashen sky pulled the cracks together to a single point above the stage, and the point stared down like a pupil. One measure before the old break, Viella did something they hadn't agreed upon. She stepped away from her music stand and stood next to Tavish, shoulder to shoulder, not as a teacher and student, but as two musicians. And that very measure, with the old, cursed interval, they played together with a single bowstroke. Perfectly. The interval fell into place with a sensation felt by everyone from the bottom of the funnel to the upper tiers, like an arm dislocated 300 years ago slipping back into place. The symphony passed the point of error and rolled toward its conclusion, now gathering on its own the very power for which it had been written. The consolidation began before the final chord. It radiated in rings from the funnel in all directions, and Chiron felt it through the stone. The lands of chaos were solidifying into firm ground. The sky above them was coalescing into the real sky. Yvain screamed from the gallery in a happy, strained voice that she could hear the other world falling silent. Only the final 8 measures remained. And in those last 8 measures, the other world settled the score. The dead orchestra began to melt away. The symphony's conclusion released everyone whom the unfinished night had held here, and they departed right in the middle of the performance. Bog melted away on his final strike of the kettle drums, and the sound of that strike faded away without him. Moraine played out her part and flowed like light into the crack in the sky, which was no longer frightening, but was simply a door. Clavel, on the podium, conducted until the 5th measure from the end and vanished with his arms raised, and his arms finished the phrase with the air itself. The living played through their tears and had no right to falter or slow down. Tavish was the second to last to leave. His figure was melting away from the feet up, yet his bow continued to glide across the strings, and Viella played beside him until his very last note. Before he melted away completely, for the first time in 300 years, he turned his face toward her, a face that now had features, and those features were smiling. The final chord remained, and Viella remained. She stood alone among the empty music stands of the dead orchestra, one of only 4 people left in the entire hall, still there because her own unfinished concert had come from another hall and held her there with a separate thread. But Chiron remembered the night of the first assault on Cantora. He remembered that on that night, the two of them had already played the finale of her concerto together, high above the burning city. Her thread had not been held by music for 3 years now. Chiron looked at her across the stage and realized what had been holding her together all this time. And Viella saw that he understood. She smiled her once in 300 years smile, raised her lunar violin, and together with the entire orchestra of the living, played the final chord of the world's score. The chord settled upon the world, not like a golden wave, more quietly, like a roof settling onto a house. From the crater to the very edges of all lands in every direction, a single unified sensation spread, one that every living being later described in their own way, yet the essence remained the same. The world ceased to be a draft. The ashen sky above the crater folded in on itself gently as one folds a letter. The crowd, a gray ripple, dissolved not into cracks, but simply into the morning light, because above the crater, for the first time in 300 years, a real morning was dawning. The upside-down scene beneath their feet flipped back to normal. Chiron stood in the middle of the familiar ancient amphitheater belonging to his twin brother, Eckhorn, beneath the familiar dawn sky. The orchestra was putting away their instruments. Up in the tiers, 500 people stood in silence because people did not yet have words for such a sight. And in the first violin's spot stood Viella, transparent in the dawn's rays, as always, not melted away. She looked at her transparent hands, then at Chiron, and said, bewildered, that she didn't understand anything. The symphony is over. Everything is over. She has nothing left to hold on to in this world, and yet she remains. It was neither she nor Chiron who found the answer to Viela's riddle, but Yvain. The seer descended to the bottom of the former crater, approached the translucent violinist closely, and listened to her for a long time with her silver eyes, as only she knew how to listen. Then she said simply, "The unfinished music had set her free 3 years ago above the burning Cantora. Since that night, it wasn't a wound that had kept her in this world. It was desire that held her here. She stayed because, for the first time in 300 years, she had a reason to stay, and the other side, as it faded away, did not take away the one who clings not to pain." Viela listened to this, standing very straight. Then she looked at Chiron, at the orchestra dismantling their instruments, and at the 500 people in the tiers, and said that in that case, she had a condition for the universe. If she was to stay, it would not be as a museum ghost. She wanted to play real strings and feel rosin on her fingers. The universe replied a month later, but first things first. There's no need to describe the return journey day by day, so here are 4 snapshots. Snapshot 1. The column marched north through lands that were learning to become real before their very eyes. Where a month ago the surface had been churning, there were now hills, and real rivers were carving out their own courses. On the 3rd day of their journey, they came upon the first village of survivors who had been hiding in a fortified cave for 11 years. People stepped out onto solid ground, felt it with their hands, and could not believe it. By the end of the journey, 6,000 people were following the column. Snapshot 2. On the 12th day, news reached them from the coast via a bone dove from Halder's new postal service. Chaos subsided across the entire world at the same hour. The kingdom of Velmar reported that, for the first time in living memory, the sea had fully receded to its shores. The 7 charter cities sent a dove bearing a single word: "Thank you." Scene 3. Yvain slept the entire way. She slept for 18 days, waking only to eat, and Selena carried her in the cart as if she were a precious treasure. The other side no longer buzzed in her ears, and the exhausted seer slept off all the years of her hearing. She woke up at the edge of the golden patch, sat up in the cart, and said in surprise that, for the first time in her life, she could hear only what everyone else heard. And she wept with relief. Cut 4. Chiron had been writing the whole way. After the world score was completed, the system gave him a result that he hadn't shown to anyone yet. Carrier level 21. The final function unlocked. The function's name was simple: transmission. Cantora greeted them in such a way that it could be heard from 5 versts away. During the campaign, the city had grown by another 1/3, and all 40,000 stood on the walls, terraces, and rooftops. Gottfried wept openly. Malric formed an honor guard from the Baron's former soldiers and stood in the ranks himself as a private. The celebration lasted 3 days, and on the 3rd day, in the middle of the festivities, Chiron stepped onto the black stage and asked for silence. He told the city the truth he had come to realize on the road. Chaos had been defeated, but peace was now secured just as the masters of Eckhorn had secured it 300 years ago, with one exception. Back then, that security had rested on a single symphony and had collapsed because of a single mistake. This must never happen again. Peace must not depend on a single symphony, a single city, or a single person, including himself. He announced what he called seeds. Cantora would send teachers throughout all the lands. In every region, there will be its own hall, its own school, and its own musicians who will be able to secure their land on their own. The power that the system called the harmony of the world will cease to be the gift of one and will become the craft of many. The system in his mind confirmed that the transmission function was intended precisely for this purpose. A bearer could permanently pass on the threads of resonance and the very skill of perfected forms to students. The city listened in silence, and then Ulbert, from the crowd, asked in his stony voice whether this meant the master would grow weaker. Chiron replied that it did. With every seed he passed on, his own power would diminish, and in the end, he would be nothing more than a musician. Perhaps the best in the world, but simply a musician. Silence hung in the air for a long time. Then 40,000 people began to clap, and they clapped so hard that an avalanche came down from the mountains, a story the shepherds would tell for years to come. There's no need to describe the year of the seeds day by day, so here are 5 snapshots. Snapshot 1. Selena received the first seed. Chiron passed on the threads and the skill to her on that same black stage, and when the transfer was complete, Selena played the first complete piece of her own composition without his support. The wind over the city settled into a pattern that lasted until evening. She traveled north to the lands of the former guild and opened her first hall there. Halder traveled with her, saying he wanted to die where he had once erred. Cut 2. Orissa took the second seed and carried it to the coast at Velmar, her hometown. The whole city saw her off, and Chiron said as a farewell that her hall would be the loudest in the world. She replied that it wouldn't be. It would be the freest. At her school, the first rule was carved above the door. No one ever sings here under duress. Third scene. The third seed was intended for Yvain, but Yvain refused it. She said she had devoted enough of her life to songs and wanted to live out the rest of her days hearing like everyone else. Instead of power, she asked Chiron for a school for people like her, for those whose gift had crippled them. The school was built in the western tier next to the School of Signs, and Yvain became not a music teacher there, but a teacher of respite from music. And to her were brought the most gifted individuals from all the lands. Cut 4. The 4th, 5th, and 6th seeds fell into the hands of strangers. A young man from the steppe cognate, an elderly weaver from the 7 cities, a student of Orvan, and the Baron's former spellcaster, that very same elder with the black staff who had come on foot across 2 mountain passes to plead his case and stood at the gates for 3 days until Brant took pity on him. Chiron passed it on and felt it waning. He extinguished the distant anchors as his own halls rose in those lands. The golden spot on Gottfried's map stopped growing and began to break apart into dozens of small spots centered in foreign cities, and that was as it should be. Cut 5. Chiron did not plant the year's final seed in a human. Together with Orvan and Ulbert, he spent the year engraving the complete score of everything he had learned into 7 stone veins beneath Cantora, a stone library that cannot be burned and cannot be lost. When Ulbert finished the last symbol, he said that now, even if every musician in the world were to choke on a fishbone at once, it wouldn't matter. The stone remembers. By the end of the year of seeds, Chiron had descended from the 21st level to the 7th and continued to descend. He noticed the changes as a matter of course. He began to grow tired after long practice sessions. He stopped being able to hear the entire city through the stone. One morning, he was unable to anchor a rain cloud over the fields, and the fields had to wait for the usual rain. He caught himself smiling at this. And the promise of the universe to Viel was fulfilled in this way. In the middle of the year of seeds, a shipment was brought to Cantora from the excavated northern hall of Echorn, which had been cleared by Alder's expedition. Alder expedition had been clearing. Among other things, they found a violin in a lead case, a genuine violin crafted by the masters of Echorn, which had lain in its sealed case for 300 years without a single crack. When the case was opened on the black stage, Viella approached the instrument, and everyone saw how her transparent hand rested on the neck and passed right through it. The instrument, crafted for perfect forms, recognized the first E-horn violin. Through this one and only object in the world, she was solid. Viela raised the violin to her shoulder, touched the strings with her bow, and wept aloud because she felt the rosin. From that day on, she played only on it, while the moon violin hung above the stage like a monument. And at the very end of the Year of Seeds, an event occurred that marked the beginning of the final chapter of this story. At the Autumn Harvest Festival, when the entire city was singing a simple song of thanksgiving from the tears, a 12-year-old girl from Selena's school, the very same one who had once sung The Blade of Grass, went on stage with her little harp and asked permission to play a piece she had composed herself. Chiron gave his permission. The girl played a simple piece about how people wait for spring in winter, and halfway through the piece, Chiron heard something in her music that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. It wasn't a mistake. On the contrary, he heard a technique he hadn't taught in any seed or engraved on any stone because he didn't know it himself. The girl had composed it on her own. The music had gone beyond her teacher. The piece ended, the city applauded, and Chiron sat in the balcony, realizing that he had just heard the most important sound of his 2 lives, the sound of something that no longer needed him. That evening, the system spoke to him for the last time of its own accord, rather than in response to a request. It reported that the independent development of art beyond the carrier had been recorded, that the task of the harmony of the world had been fully accomplished, and that the host had one final unspent reserve of power, enough for one great form. The system asked what he wanted. Chiron sat on the upper tier of his city. Below, the windows of 40,000 houses glowed. Somewhere, an evening choir was singing. Selena was in the north of Orissa, by the Sea of Ivane. At her school, Viela, she was on stage with her real violin, and next to her on the tier sat Brant, silently repairing a scabbard. Chiron watched all of this for a very long time. Then he replied to the system that he knew what he wanted. He wanted to compose his final symphony. Not to secure peace. Peace is already secure. Just a symphony. A gift. And to play it once for everyone this story has brought together. The system fell silent for the first time in all those years. Then it replied that this was the most non-functional use of the great form in all its memory, and that it agreed. Chiron wrote his final symphony throughout the winter and spring, and it was the most difficult work of both his lives because, for the first time, he was writing music that owed nothing to anyone. Not to stop the ripples, not to break the collar, not to save the army, not to secure peace. Simply to tell people what he had no words for. He began it 12 times, and 12 times he burned what he had written in the stove, much to the horror of Gottfried, who was counting the sheets of music paper one by one. On the 13th try, he realized his mistake. He had been trying to write a symphony about himself, about a musician who died at the piano and was born in the mud. But he needed to write about them. He set aside the blank paper, took his travel coat, and spent the winter on the road. He traveled to everyone who was part of this story and spent a week with each one, simply listening. A journey through people pieced together. At Selena's place up north, he sat for a week on the back bench of her hall, listening as she taught the children of former weavers to breathe before a phrase. Something had appeared in her manner that hadn't been there before. The patience of the wind that wears away the rock over centuries and is in no hurry to go anywhere. Chiron recorded that patience in musical notes on the back of his lodging bill. At Orissa's in Velmar, he spent a week listening to the sea and her morning chants by the sea. She sang now more softly than before and more powerfully than before, and 400 children studied at her school, including Baron Malric's 2 grandsons, which was a story in itself. When he left, he took with him her way of hitting the first note as if a door were opening not outward, but inward. At Yvain's, he spent a week at a summer camp and saw her laugh for the first time. That month, a boy was brought to her who could hear the thoughts of stones and was going mad from it, and Yvain was teaching him not to listen. Chiron asked her that evening if she regretted giving up her gift. Yvain replied that you don't give up a gift. You simply stop confusing the gift with yourself. He wrote down that phrase in musical notation right there in front of her. There was nothing to record from Brant because Brant didn't sing, but the week with Brant gave the symphony its rhythm. In the mornings, the chief of the guard would make the young men run along the wall, and his count of steps was the most honest rhythm Chiron had ever heard in his life. The rhythm of a man who stands tall not for a parade, but because there are people behind him. Returning in the spring, Chiron wrote the symphony in 19 days, didn't burn a single sheet of paper, and gave it a simple title, The Road. 5 movements. Each movement embodied one of them, and together they embodied everything that had happened, from the gray ripples to that very day. There was no 6th movement. Instead of the 6th movement, there was a blank page in the score, and when the orchestra asked, Chiron replied that the 6th movement isn't written in advance. The performance was scheduled for the summer solstice, marking the 3rd anniversary of Cantora's founding. Invitations were carried by bone doves to all corners of the land, and the world responded so enthusiastically that Gottfried clutched his head in disbelief. Everyone was coming. Selena from the north with 40 students. Orissa by sea with an entire ship full of singers. The Kagan of the steppes with 100 horsemen carrying mares as a gift. Embassies from the 7 cities. A delegation from Velmar. Halder, who was already being carried in a cart because his legs had given out, though the old man's eyes were clear, and he argued with Orvin about the theory of signs the entire way. By the solstice, 100,000 people had gathered in the Cantora Basin and on the surrounding slopes. The world had never seen so many people in one place. Ulbert and the stonemasons had spent a month building additional tiers on the slopes, and he swore that the stone would hold, but he himself, overcome with excitement, might not. The evening of the concert was quiet and golden. Chiron stepped onto the black stage with a silver zither, and the Cantora orchestra, which had grown to 200 members, took their places behind him. Viella stood at the first podium with Ekhorn's violin. No one stood on the conductor's podium. Chiron conducted the Road Symphony himself from his instrument, just as he had conducted everything in this life. The first movement belonged to Selena and was titled The Wind Learns to Wait in the score. Orissa's second movement was titled The Door Opens Inward. Yvain's third movement was played almost in a whisper and was titled Silence is Also a Note. Brant's fourth movement kept the rhythm of footsteps along the wall, and 100,000 listeners didn't even notice how they had begun breathe in that rhythm. The fifth movement was Viella's, and in it, Chiron gave the lead to the first violin while he himself stepped back into the accompaniment. Viella played the part on real strings, a piece about the one who stayed not out of pain but out of desire, and when she finished, 100,000 people were silent longer than they later applauded. And then came the time for the blank page. Chiron lowered his citra and spoke into the silence. The weaver's channel carried his soft voice all the way to the back rows on the slopes. He said that he would not be the one to write the sixth movement of this symphony. He told them about the system he had carried within himself from day one, about the levels of the thread and its functions. And he said that the last remnant of his great power he was now investing not in sound, but in an invitation. The sixth movement would be what they sang. Everyone. 100,000, each in their own way. He asked only one thing. Let everyone sing not about what was, but about what they want to become. He raised his hand, then lowered it. The first voices joined in, out of tune and timidly, like the first raindrops. The children from Selena's school began to sing about spring. The steppe-dwellers struck up a low song about the road that never ends. Velmar's sailors sang of the shore. Someone sang without words. The old woman next to Gottfried sang a lullaby, that very first lullaby from the market that the entire South had learned over the past 3 years. 100,000 voices joined in one after another, and it was bound to turn into a jumble. It didn't turn into a jumble. At that moment, the last remnant of Chiron's strength was working not as an amplifier, but as his hearing. He stood at the focal point of the 7 veins, hearing all 100,000 lines at once, and with his zither, using light strokes, he guided the voices toward one another. He wasn't directing, he was bringing them together. The song of the steppe turned out to be a third to the song of the sea. The lullaby settled in the bass beneath the children's spring. A quarter of an hour later, a melody resounded above the cantora bowl, one that no one had composed, yet everyone had created. And it was complete not according to the rules of composition, but according to some other law that Chiron had sought for 2 lifetimes and had only now found. The system in his mind silently showed him a number, exactly 100,000 threads of response, everyone who had ever been. And beneath that number, the final message. The remaining power has been exhausted. The carrier has been released. Thank you for your work. The system used the word thank you for the first time in all these years. The 6th part ended on its own, just as rain ends, not on command. Simply, at some moment, everyone sensed that everything had been said, and the voices fell silent one by one until there was silence, and that silence was part of the form, its final note. And then 100,000 people stood up. They applauded standing for so long that the sun set, and they continued in the darkness. And Obert later swore that his new tears were swaying, but the stone held firm because the stone was listening too. That night after the concert, when the hall had emptied, Chiron stayed on stage alone to tidy up the consoles, a habit from a past life. He was gathering the sheet music when he sensed he wasn't alone. At the edge of the stage stood Viela, holding Eckhorn's violin in her lowered hand, looking at him strangely. He asked what was wrong. She was silent for a long time. Then she said that during the 6th movement, when they sang 100,000, she felt something she hadn't felt in 300 years and 3 years. Fatigue. Simple human fatigue in her legs. She caught the violin, held her palm up to the torchlight, and Chiron saw. Her palm was no longer translucent. The fire was no longer visible through it. Viela stood on the black stage, as solid as any living person, and tears streamed down her face, falling onto the stone and leaving wet spots. Real ones. She whispered that it seemed as though 100,000 people that night wanted everything to be well for everyone in this city. Everyone, without exception. And that someone's simple song had recognized her for who she was. In the fall, after the grand concert, Chiron's life finally began to feel like a life. The system was silent because it had nothing left to calculate. There were no more levels. There were no more threads. There was a city of 40,000 windows. There was an orchestra. There was a school where children sang in the mornings. And there was a man who had started it all, and who now carried water from the well himself in the mornings, because he could no longer, and no longer wanted to, anchor the clouds over the vegetable garden. Viela was learning to live all over again, and she was learning in a comical way. She hadn't eaten for 3 centuries and was now making up for lost time, so that the tavern cooks would rush to her side the moment she appeared. She got sunburned during her very first week of physical existence and walked around for a week red and angry as a boiled crab, and Selena, who had come to visit, laughed until she cried. She froze in the winter, and it delighted her. She collected every discomfort of a living body like a miser collects coins. When Chiron asked if she missed the days when she was invulnerable and eternal, she replied that eternity is a very long dress rehearsal, while living is finally stepping out before the public. That same fall, the Cantora Council convened for a meeting that Gottfried later called the strangest in the city's history. Chiron placed a piece of paper on the table and asked to be relieved of his position as head of the council. He said that the city no longer needed its founder at the helm. Gottfried knows how to run the household. Malric knows the books. Brant knows the walls. As long as Halder is alive, he knows the signs. And Orwin will take over after him. Selena and Arissa hold the north and the sea. A council made up of these people would lead Cantora better than a single weary musician. And the musician asks that they leave him the school and the stage. They argued until nightfall. Brant remained silent throughout the entire debate, but at the end he said one thing. He said that for 15 years he had served people who clung to power with their teeth, and that for the first time in his life he was seeing a man who was giving it up as one would pay a debt. And that this should be the city's first law. Power is given up. The council voted, and these 2 words became the first line of Cantora's charter. Halder died that winter. He died peacefully. In his school of signs, after reviewing his last student's work, placing an approving mark beneath it, and falling asleep in a chair by the stove. The entire city buried him, and the elders, who had once fled from the bone seals, carried his coffin at the head of the procession because they themselves had decided to do so. On the gravestone, Orvin engraved a single phrase, as per the old man's will. Here lies a man who managed to redeem himself. Chiron played at the funeral, and it was the first music he had played since the great concert. A simple piece, devoid of any power. Just a farewell. And standing over the grave, he caught himself thinking that music without power turned out to be no weaker. It was the very same music he had served in his first life, back when he knew nothing of any systems. The circle was closing, and closing just right. In the spring, an embassy arrived in Cantoru that no one had expected. From across the ocean, a ship with unfamiliar sails brought people from another continent, known in these lands only through fairy tales. The ambassador, a swarthy man with weary eyes, explained through the interpreter Velmar that half a year ago, at the same hour across their entire continent, the eternal chaos, which they called the devouring mist, had subsided. The sky settled into place. The sea retreated to its shores. Their sages had spent half a year searching for the source of the miracle, walking in circles around their fortifications, just as one walks in circles on water. And those circles led their ship here, to the city in the basin. The ambassador asked who had done this and what his people owed for their salvation. The council assembled in full, and Chiron came as well, for he had been summoned as a witness. The ambassador expected to be shown a god or a king. Instead, he was shown a graying musician in simple clothes, who stood up and said that no one owed anyone anything. And then he added what, in his words, made it worth crossing the ocean. He said that a miracle cannot be given as a gift, but it can be taught. And he suggested that the ambassador take home not gold, but 7 graduates of the Cantora school, who would establish the first hall on that continent and teach their first students. The ambassador left a month later, taking the 7 with him. Among the 7 was that very girl with the harp, who had just turned 16 and who had asked to go across the ocean herself, telling her teacher that since music had gone further than he had, someone needed to go further along with it. Chiron saw the ship off at the Velmar pier, where he had gone specifically for that purpose. He stood next to Arissa, watching the sail fade beyond the horizon, and felt not a sense of loss, but rather what a sower feels when looking at a flock of birds carrying away seeds, a sense of true lightness. That summer, on the anniversary of the solstice, Cantora celebrated its 4th year, and as always, all its people gathered for the festivities. In the evening, when the official part was over and the city was out strolling along the terraces, the old gang gathered where it had all begun, on the black stage. They arrived one after another without any prior arrangement, Brant with a flask, Gottfried with Malric, arguing about something related to duties, Yvain looking refreshed and calm, Selena with her northern tan, Arissa with her seaside tan, Orwin and Olbert. Viella arrived last with a basket of food because she no longer accepted gatherings without food. They sat in a circle right on the warm stone, just as they had once sat during the first construction project. They talked until the stars came out. They reminisced about the market and the gray ripples. 4 strings, Malgard's chimney, the dome of silence and how 4,000 breathed, the collapse of the symphony. They remained silent about those who were not there, about the 190 from the mass grave, about Halder, about the 40 musicians of the 4th hall. Their silence about them, too, was a conversation. And then, Yvain, who had spent the entire evening listening more than speaking, suddenly said she wanted to make a confession. The last time in her life that she had still been able to hear the other side, at the very moment the world score came to an end, she had caught one final vision and carried it within her for 4 years, not knowing if anyone needed it. Now she knows it is needed. Everyone fell silent. Yvain said the vision had been brief. She had seen this world 100 years from now. None of those sitting here were in it anymore. But in every corner of the earth there were halls, hundreds of halls. And on that very same evening, in all the halls at once, they were playing the same piece. Because over the course of 100 years, the world had developed a tradition. Once a year, on the day of the solstice, all the musicians of the earth play the symphony of the journey of a man whom historians still debate, whether he was one person or several. The first 5 movements are played from sheet music, but the 6th movement, in every hall across every land, is still sung by the audience. Each person sings about what they want to come to pass, and the world stood firm in this vision. Not because some great power held it together, but because 100,000 times, 100,000 people each year sang anew to it there, "This is what we want to become." Yvain fell silent. Summer stars shone overhead. Somewhere on the lower terraces, the strolling city sang its own song, discordantly yet happily. Chiron listened to both the city and the silence of his people, and realized that this was the full stop. Not a cliffhanger like in his first life. Not a cliffhanger like in all his story arcs. A full stop placed at the end of a completed form, after which silence, too, is a note. He stood up, picked up the citra, which, as always, was with him, and said that since everyone had gathered, it would be a shame not to play. Viella pulled out her violin before he had even finished speaking. Selena looked around for her harp, didn't find it, and simply stirred up a warm breeze around the stage. Arissa stood up, and out of old habit, played the first note, just as one would open a door to step inside. Yvain smiled and quietly hummed along, for the first time in her life, to a song that cost her nothing. And they played until morning, for the city out on the streets, for the summer stars, and simply for each other, that old lullaby from the ruined market. The very one with which it all began. 3 parts: introduction, development, conclusion. And this time, the conclusion. 7 days before Halder's bone dove rose above the ruined market, 300 versts to the east, in the citadel of the Bone Chapter, another meeting of the rectorate was underway. The citadel stood on a bare rock above the city of Weismund and had no windows. 300 years ago, the guild's founder had stipulated in his will that it be built without windows, because those who look outward begin to listen to the outside world. The rectorate consisted of 5 people and decided the fates of all the lands of the charter, though the lands themselves had no idea of this. People thought they were ruled by the councils of the 7 cities. The councils of the 7 cities thought they ruled on their own. In reality, every council was up to its ears in the guild's ledgers, and every ledger lay here in the citadel's basements. The supreme rector in the 22nd year was a man named Morvain. A gaunt, tall old man with a voice quieter than a candle flame. He never raised his voice because others raised it for him. At that meeting, the rectorate was discussing plans to shut down 2 wild springs in the mountain principalities and Baron Malric's overdue debt. The Baron's debt amounted to 90,000 gold pieces and was growing. The rector of the treasury proposed seizing 2 fortresses from the Baron. Morvain refused. He said that fortresses were mere stones, while a debtor was a tool. A tool was more valuable than stones. They decided to keep the Baron on a long leash until the right opportunity arose. The right opportunity flew in 7 days later on wings of bone. Halder's pigeon landed on the reception desk at night, and the master on duty roused the rectorate before dawn, something that had happened only 3 times in 20 years. The report was brief. Halder, a third circle master, reported a wild source of unprecedented power. A wandering musician had halted a wave of chaos with a complete musical form before the eyes of 200 witnesses. The rectorate passed the report around in a circle, and Morvain read it last, and for the longest time. Then he stood up and used his key to open the door to the archive level, to which only the Supreme Rector had access. Whispers about this level circulated within the guild. Morvain went down alone and spent 3 hours down there. Not even the rectorate knew what lay in the archive level. And there lay the truth about the guild's founding. 300 years ago, the civilization of Eckhorn was not destroyed by divine retribution or an invasion. It was destroyed by its own music. The guild's founder, Master Urwald, was the custodian of Eckhorn's 7th hall, and the only one of that night's overseers to survive, because he had left the hall 1 minute before the collapse of the world score. He saw how the culmination of the greatest form unraveled from a single incorrect interval, and how the entire force of stabilization turned inside out and devoured the 7 halls and all its people. Urwald fled eastward through the seething chaos, carrying on his back a single rescued apprentice and a single conclusion. The conclusion was seared by his hand onto the first page of the charter, which had lain in the archive tier for 300 years. The world cannot be entrusted to music. A form that can anchor everything can also destroy everything. From now on and forevermore, hold the lands with small signs, small walls, and small forces. Quash anyone who reaches for the great. Silence is imperfect, but silence is never wrong. The guild stood by this conclusion. Generations of rectors erased the name of Eckhorn and the reason for the ban, yet the ban itself had become ingrained in their very bones. The weavers sincerely believed they were extinguishing wild sources for the sake of saving the world, and in a certain sense, they were not lying. They were saving the world from a repeat of a night they themselves no longer remembered. Morvain knew. Morvain was the only living person up there who had read the entire archive. And so he did not read Halder's report as a report on a brazen vagrant. He read it as the first line of an ancient verdict. A musician who completes the forms is not a violator of the charter. He is a second Ehorn in the making. In the morning, the rectorate approved the measures, and those measures will seem familiar to anyone who remembers the main story. A wild source declared a threat to the foundations. Sheets bearing a bone seal were posted on every pillar along the road. 500 gold pieces for a dead man and 700 for a live one, because Morvain wanted to interrogate first and then eliminate. A squad of hunters set out from Wisemond at noon. What follows reveals another side to events already known from one perspective. The hunters did not catch up to the column of refugees, not because Brant was burning bridges, although Brant was burning bridges. The hunters did not catch up to the column because the senior hunter had received 2 orders before setting out. A loud order from the rectorate to catch up and capture them, and a quiet order from Cassian, the rector of doctrine, to follow the trail but not to force the issue, because a source of such power must first be gauged and only then touched. Cassian was the youngest of the 5 rectors and a man of many faces. Officially, he oversaw the purity of doctrine. Unofficially, for 20 years he had been gathering around him masters who harbored doubts. The circle called itself the Listeners and met in the bathhouses of the lower city, where the steam drowned out any signs of eavesdropping. The listeners had long since noticed what was forbidden to speak of. Chaos was intensifying from decade to decade, and the guild's walls were weakening. The small signs were dying off faster and faster. The doctrine of the small forces was losing the war of attrition, and the rectorate responded to this only by increasing the number of suppressions. Cassian was searching for another solution, and the report about the musician sounded to him not like a death sentence, but like hope. Cut to the next scene. Cut 1. While Chiron led the column south, the chapter watched him through the eyes of others. Merchants in debt reported on interest write-offs. Morvain plotted every step on the map, and when the column reached the dead bowl of Ekhorn, the old man stayed awake all night for the first time in 20 years. He was the only one in the entire citadel who knew what that bowl was. Cut 2. When a month later, merchants brought back rumors of a city free of chaos, the rectorate laughed off the tale as a fairy tale. Morvain did not laugh. He sent 3 secret masters to Cantora disguised as refugees. 2 sent back reports full of enthusiasm and were recalled and stripped of their insignia for showing weakness. The 3rd was Orvin. Scene 3. The Collar. When Baron Malric, a year before the main events, asked the guild for a means to restrain a captive singer whose voice bolstered the rectorate's troops, the rectorate sold him a golden collar from its old storerooms in exchange for forgiveness of 1/3 of his debt. The collar was forged by the guild's foremost masters according to Urwald's own design, and it had exactly one purpose: to prevent completion. Morvain, handing the collar to the Baron, told the rectorate that it was better for a dangerous voice to be chained to a fool than to roam the world. Thus, Arissa found herself in a cage by the decision of people she had never seen. Scene 4. Malgard. News of the contest and the broken collar reached the citadel within 2 days, and for the first time in 20 years, shouts rang out in the council chamber. Breaking Urwald's collar meant dismantling the very framework of his suppression, something that, according to all calculations of the doctrine, was impossible. Morvain listened to the outcry in silence, and after the session, he went down to the archives and sat there until morning. He emerged with a decision that the rectorate adopted unanimously, for no one knew how to argue with his voice, which was quieter than a candle. The guild is raising what it has not raised 3 times in 300 years: the Great Silence. 40 bone pillars were hauled from the citadel's cellars on oxen under a black cloth. The alliance with the Baron was formalized in a single evening, just as stated in the main narrative. But the main narrative did not know the true cost. Morvain forgave Malric the entire debt of 90,000 and pledged 2 debt ledgers of the city of Weismund as a token of loyalty. He paid as one pays when buying not victory, but the salvation of the world. The old man sincerely believed that he was bringing to Cantor. He believed he was bringing a cure. On the night before the combined forces set out, Cassian made his move. He summoned Orvin using a secret signal via the bone mail and ordered him not to return, but to go into the city to the musician and observe what happened from the inside. Formally, this was treason. Cassian framed it as a deep reconnaissance mission and signed the order with his personal seal, knowing that the signature might one day cost him his hands. That same night, he placed in Orvin's travel bag something the rectorate had not ordered: a complete description of the Great Silence, including the locations of the pillars and the deployment times. Those present voted on it in the bathhouse by raising their palms, and the vote took less than a minute. Thus, the dome's blueprint ended up in Cantor 5 days before the dome itself, and the mainstream media reported it as an honest impulse on the part of a deserter. Orwin only truly became a deserter later, when he saw the girl with the blade of grass. Cassian hadn't planned this. It just happened. The army set out at dawn, and Morvain, against all the rectorate's rules,
rode with them personally. The 5 rectors had never left the citadel at the same time, but Morvain said that the very foundation of the doctrine could not be entrusted to reports alone. He rode in the middle of the column in an unmarked gray wagon, watching the marching wedges of weavers, and the senior hunter heard the supreme rector in the wagon quietly repeating something to himself. The hunter decided the old man was praying. The old man was not praying.
For the 301st time, the old man was reviewing Urwald's calculations, and for the first time in 22 years, he found a discrepancy in them. Morvain found the discrepancy in the numbers. In his calculations, Urwald had determined the force of the collapse of the world orders and concluded that the inverted form would destabilize the world with a constant force for all eternity. For 20 years, Morvain had been cross-checking this calculation against reports of chaos, and the chaos was growing rather than remaining static. A constant force does not grow. What grows is a force that learns. Urwald had not foreseen this, and if the founder had erred in a single number, he might have erred in his conclusion as well. The old man was traveling to Cantora to destroy the great form, and for the first time, the entire way, he admitted to himself that he was carrying a cure for the wrong disease. He watched the battle in the valley from a hilltop in his gray wagon, and he saw it all. He saw how the dome of silence crushed the city, and how the city responded with stone, something no calculation had foreseen, because Urwald's notes contained not a single line about stone. He saw the breach and the voice of the singer with the broken collar, and how 8,000 soldiers began to think. He gave Halder the order for the sign of the harvest with his own hand, and his hand did not tremble, because the doctrine permitted reaping one's own for the sake of the dome. And then a pack came from the south, and Morvain, from the hill, saw what caused his calculations to crumble completely. Chaos marched in formation. Chaos had command and a purpose, and its purpose was not the city. The old man watched as the beasts regarded the living army like a granary and realized that the guild had been preparing for a flood for 300 years, but a fire had come instead. When the gates of Cantora opened and the orchestra emerged, Morvain ordered the coachman to drive closer. The guards objected. He didn't listen. He stopped the cart 300 paces from the procession and listened to the march for loyal soldiers from beginning to end, standing on the running board. He was the only one in the entire field who knew what he was hearing. He had read descriptions of Ehorn's music in the archives, and now it was coming at him in reality, and it was not the weapon described in the reports. The dome starved to death before his very eyes. The Baron's army toppled the pillars they were hauling from his cellars. The weavers' wedges scattered, and Morvain saw Halder, alone among the fallen pillars, straighten up and walk toward the enemy's gates. The old man on the cart's footboard looked at the old man at the gates and realized he was looking at his own untraveled path. Then the pack began to sing, and the song marked the beginning and the end of Urwald's days burned away. Chaos completed the form. So chaos and form were not opposites, as the doctrine had taught for 300 years. So the entire doctrine was based on the fear of a single night, not on the order of the world. Morvain got into the cart and ordered the driver to take him not to the citadel, but south along the edge of the valley, because he wanted to see the outcome. From a distance, he saw Halder's 41 weavers building a channel for the wild spring. He saw the collective harmony of 7,000 gulps with the flock and the variations in their departure, and the vision of death that the blind woman had revealed to his heart. He saw the dispersal of 10,000 creatures in gray dew and a pillar of sparks. The coachman later recounted in taverns that the Supreme Rector had remained silent the entire way back, but once spoke 4 words into the void. The boy concluded our scene. The rest follows in the edit. Cut 1. The Citadel greeted Morvain with the news that Halder had surrendered the Great Master's seal and joined the Council of the enemy city, while 38 weavers had remained with him. The rectorate demanded that they all be declared apostates. Morvain issued a ban and explained himself for the first time. He told the rectorate that the guild had not lost a battle but 300 years, and that before judging the apostates, they must reread the charter. That night, the rector of the treasury wrote a secret letter to the 7 cities stating that the supreme rector had softened his stance. Second cut. Cassian came to Morvain himself and placed on the table the seal with which he had signed the order to Orvin. He was awaiting his trial. Morvain looked at the seal and asked how many years the listeners had been gathering in the bathhouses. Cassian replied that it had been 20. Morvain said he had known about them for 19 years and had left them alone because the guild needed a place to harbor its doubts. Then he returned the seal and, for the first time in 22 years, asked the junior rector for help rather than giving an order. Cut 3. When intelligence reported that Cantora was gathering for a march south toward the crater, the rectorate split. 3 demanded a strike from behind on the column while it was on the march, while the city's forces were moving separately from the walls. The plan was reasonable by all measures of the old doctrine, and the hunting companies had already been issued rations. Morvain shot down the plan with a single question. He asked the 3 what the guild would do about the crater if the musician died on the march. No one had an answer. The companies were dismissed to their barracks. And so, the mainstream narrative never learned that, in the 3rd week of the journey, Chiron's column had been in the crosshairs of 200 hunters, and that it was not Selena's dome that saved it, but a quiet question asked in a windowless hall. Cut 4. On the day when, far to the south, the united orchestra of the living and the dead entered into a falling symphony, Morvain sat alone in the archive gallery. He no longer reread the calculations. He simply waited among the shelves as one waits for a verdict. The completion of the world score reached the citadel through the rock. The windowless walls trembled once, gently, just as everything in the world trembled, and on the bare rock above Weismond, for the first time in 300 years, something happened to the sound. The citadel had been built to be soundproof, and throughout Morvain's entire life, a cotton-wool silence had reigned in its halls. Now the silence had become ordinary, alive. In it, one could hear a quill scratching on the floor above and a dog barking down in the city. The old man sat among the archives in this first true silence of his life and wept, something that hadn't happened to him in 60 years. Then he did the last thing a supreme rector was supposed to do. He took Urwald's charter to carry it upstairs and make it public, and that's when he noticed what 12 generations of rectors had overlooked. The charter's binding was thicker than the block of pages. He cut open the binding with a penknife, and a sheet folded in 4 fell out from beneath the leather. It was the final page of the charter, hidden there by the founder himself. The handwriting was the same as on the first page, but the style was different, that of an old man. Urwald had written this at the end of his life. He wrote that the ban on the great forms was not the truth, but a tourniquet on a wound, and that bandage left on forever kills the body. He wrote that the calculations of his youth were incomplete and that the inverted symphony would continue to grow until one day the question arose in all its sharpness. He wrote that only the one who comes to music not out of strength but out of loss would be able to remove the tourniquet, and he bequeathed to the rector who would live to see such a person not to stifle him but to give him everything. And the last line explained why Morvain kept him poring over the sheet until morning. Urwald wrote that he was deliberately leaving the doctrine of fear to the guild because 300 years of fear would preserve the world until the arrival of the right person more reliably than 300 years of hope. The founder established the guild as a form of preservation, like a glacier for the world, and the glacier melted exactly on schedule. From there, everything ties in with what is already known. The Weavers' Guild was dissolved by an official act of the rectorate a month after the completion of the partitura, and the rectorate dissolved itself through the final paragraph of that act. Morvain personally burned the ledgers of the 7 cities in the citadel's courtyard, and in Weismund, Bells rang that day as if it were a holiday. Cassian, along with most of the masters, left for the north to Selena Hall, and Halder's School of Signs gained its second wing. The bone mail service was transferred to the city and became simply the postal service. And the windowless citadel stood empty for a year until Evine asked that the building be given to her school, because for the overburdened gifted, there is no better place than walls trained to muffle sound. In the muffled halls where sentences were once written, those whose gift had driven them to the brink now slept off their exhaustion, and Morvain, upon learning of this, said that the rock was finally being used for its intended purpose. He did not travel north, nor did he go to Cantora. He settled in Weismund with his niece, kept bees, and replied to every invitation that the man who had signed the harvest order had no place among the students. He passed the charter, with its final page, to Halder via Cassian, and in the main narrative this scroll is never mentioned because Halder read it and decided that a city that had already done everything correctly had no need for someone else's will. He placed the charter in the stone library under the seventh sign, and there it remains. On one occasion, however, Morvain did break his seclusion. On the day of the summer solstice, on the third anniversary of Cantora, among 100,000 people on the distant slope sat a tall, gaunt old man in a gray cloak without insignia whom no one recognized. He listened to the 5 movements of the Road Symphony without moving, and when the musician on the black stage announced the 6th movement and asked everyone to sing about what they wanted to happen, the old man on the slope remained silent for a long time amid the rising voices. Then he closed his eyes and, quietly, without hearing or using his voice, sang for the first time in his life. No one knew what he was singing about, and that's just as well. The 6th movement is the 6th movement for a reason. He returned home to Weismund to his bees, lived out 4 more quiet years, and died in his sleep on an ordinary night. In accordance with his will, neither his name nor any symbol was engraved on his gravestone. Just 5 words. He too had managed to make amends.